In the high deserts of New Mexico, the silence isn't empty, it's hiding something. Out here, shadows stretch longer, stories vanish faster, and the line between reality and folklore crumbles like sun-baked stone. UFO crashes, vanishing children, haunted staircases, whole lives erased without a trace. These aren't ghost stories. They're documented puzzles the experts still can't solve, and the deeper you look, the stranger it gets. So buckle in, because these aren't just 33 mysteries. They're warnings etched into the sand, unsolved, unspoken, and absolutely unignorable. Welcome to New Mexico, where the weird isn't rare, it's routine. Before we dive headfirst into the unknown, do me a quick favor. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into the strange and unsolvable. And while you're here, drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Michigan? 3 a.m. in Tokyo? Let's see how far this mystery travels. Roswell UFO Incident. In the summer of 1947, something crashed in the high desert outside Roswell, New Mexico. Something that would, for better or worse, tattoo the words UFO and cover-up into the American imagination forever. It began, as most legends do, with a thunderstorm and a rancher who wasn't looking for trouble. William Mac Brazel was checking on his sheep when he found debris scattered across his property, thin metallic strips, oddly light, crumpled like tinfoil but snapping back to their original shape when unfolded. There were beams that didn't burn, strange hieroglyphics that didn't flake off, and a silence in the desert that suddenly felt a little too intentional. Brazel did what any decent rancher would do in 1947. He told the sheriff told the military, and then the world shifted slightly. The Roswell Army Airfield released a statement that they had recovered a flying disc, just like that, no hesitation. But almost as quickly as that announcement hit the airwaves, it was yanked back like a dog that strayed too far from the leash. The story changed magically, unconvincingly. The flying disc was now a weather balloon, a very normal, very mundane, very earthly balloon. Nothing to see here. Go home. Except people didn't. Not really. The headlines that followed painted a jittery collage of contradictions. Reporters smelled something off. Witnesses were quietly dismissed, and some weren't quiet at all. Jesse Marcel, an intelligence officer with the military who had handled the wreckage, claimed decades later that what he saw wasn't from this earth. He wasn't some fringe theorist or desert eccentric, he was military brass, and he never quite let it go. Then came the layers, decades of them. In 1994, the Air Force finally released a report explaining that what had actually crashed near Roswell was debris from Project Mogul, a top-secret military operation designed to detect Soviet nuclear tests using high-altitude balloon arrays. That would have been a great explanation if it hadn't taken them nearly 50 years to share it. By then, the myth had already metastasized. It wasn't just the crash site that felt suspicious. It was the overwhelming neatness of the retraction, the sudden backpedaling, the photographs of strange materials being identified by straight-faced officers who looked like they were reading from invisible cue cards. Even the newspaper clippings have a certain haunted quality, as if they themselves are waiting for the real story to show up. And here's the thing about Roswell. It didn't start the UFO craze. It retroactively became the icon of it. In the years that followed, UFO sightings exploded across the country. Roswell wasn't a standalone event, it was a door that opened just wide enough to let the imagination crawl in and make itself comfortable. And whether what fell from the sky that day was alien, experimental, or just embarrassingly terrestrial, the aftermath became more mysterious than the wreckage itself. You have to ask, why such a rapid reversal? Why the strange treatment of witnesses, the sealed files, the conflicting testimonies? Why keep revisiting the scene, rewriting the narrative every decade like a movie studio scared of losing intellectual property? Even if you buy the Project Mogul story, and many do, it's hard to explain away the persistent fog that clings to the incident. The culture of silence, the compulsion to control the story at all costs. Roswell has the stink of redaction, and redactions, by nature, beg to be read between the lines. By the time the town leaned into its alien branding, the damage, or perhaps the enchantment, was already done. Roswell became a kind of pilgrimage for truth-seekers, hoaxers, and conspiracy archaeologists. A place where truth and fiction hold hands and whisper back and forth, unsure who started the conversation. And all the while, the desert just watches, quiet, indifferent, and full of memory. Because no matter how many official explanations come tumbling out, the public imagination remains a locked box with a missing key. Something happened in Roswell, something inconvenient. And the most uncomfortable part? It might not matter what it was. What matters is that someone, somewhere, decided we couldn't handle it. Which leads us to another case of hidden fortunes and forbidden digging, a very different kind of mystery, but one that also begins beneath the New Mexican soil, not in the stars, but in gold. Hidden, maybe cursed, and just as evasive. Victorio Peak Treasure. In the barren heart of the Hembrillo Basin, surrounded by the scorched mountain ranges of southern New Mexico, lies a peak so unremarkable it barely registers against the skyline. Victorio Peak. A name that sounds like it belongs in an old Western shootout, and frankly, that wouldn't be far off. Except the real drama came not from pistols, but from a man named Milton Ernest Doc Noss, and a treasure that might exist, might not, but has obsessed gold hunters, government agencies, and at least one dead dentist for nearly a century. The story begins, as all decent treasure myths do, with a claim so outrageous it sounds like a dare. In 1937, Doc Noss and his wife Ova were wandering through the Jornada del Muerto desert, a name which unironically translates to Journey of the Dead Man, when they stumbled upon a small opening in Victorio Peak. Inside, they claimed, was a tunnel system that led into a cavern, and in that cavern, treasure. Not metaphorical treasure, literal treasure, crates of it, stacks of gold bars, jewels, documents, Spanish armor, even allegedly mummified remains leaning against the walls like bored museum curators waiting for someone to turn on the lights. Doc, a bootlegger turned medicine man turned everyman, couldn't believe his luck. And in a turn of events that seems pulled directly from a treasure hunter's worst-case playbook, he didn't exactly handle the discovery with a lot of subtlety. Instead of securing the site quietly, Doc began removing gold what he could carry piece by piece, hiding it around the desert. At some point, he started talking. Too much. Whispers turned to rumors. Rumors turned into threats. And before the gold fever had even settled into a manageable paranoia, Doc Noss was shot and killed in 1949, not by a government agent, not by a jealous rival, but by an associate, Charlie Ryan, who claimed Doc had pulled a gun on him first. A simple argument, an ending that, legally, tied itself up in a bow. Except the gold was never found again. And here's where the mystery calcifies. After Doc's death, his wife Ova and a rotating cast of fortune seekers tried everything to re-access the cavern. But somehow, the entrance was gone, collapsed, sealed, shifted by a miscalculated blast of dynamite. The desert had taken its secret back. Of course, the military had questions. Because, unfortunately for anyone hoping to quietly excavate a hoard of cursed gold bars, Victorio Peak is located within the White Sands Missile Range, a heavily restricted military zone, and when the U.S. government controls the land tends to stop talking. Still, the legend refused to die. Over the years, the site was quietly investigated by several parties, including a curious stretch during the early 1962nd, when the U.S. Army allowed selected civilians and private contractors to dig at the peak. Officially, nothing was found. Unofficially? Well, that depends on which whispered version of the truth you prefer. Some claim the army found gold, and quietly removed it. Others say nothing was there, and the real treasure is buried in paperwork layers of lost permits, forged maps, and classified files that make the peak more of a bureaucratic sinkhole than a geological one. There's a curious footnote involving President Eisenhower, who some claim was briefed on the existence of the treasure. Another story suggests that a CIA front company may have been involved in covert operations to extract materials from the peak. All highly speculative, all suspiciously plausible. But what's fact when you're this deep in legend? By the 1982nd and 92nd, the Victoria Peak treasure had become the ultimate Schrodinger's hoard, both there and not there. A secret kept so well that even the people protecting it might not be sure it ever existed. And that's the real paradox here. Let's say the treasure was real. That means, at some point, a vast quantity of gold, possibly tens of thousands of pounds, was successfully hidden inside a peak that now doubles as missile test ground zero. If it's still there, it's untouchable. If it was taken, no one's talking. If it never existed, that would make Doc Noss one of the most committed liars in American folklore, dragging generations of people into the desert over a fantasy. The Victoria Peak story thrives not because we trust Doc Noss, but because we want him to be telling the truth. The mystery doesn't rest on gold bars. It rests on what happens to people when they think they're this close to changing their lives forever. Just one more dig. Just one more clue. Just one more lie you choose to believe. Because the truth is too mundane. And as the military base continues to conduct test flights and closed-door operations over the exact same terrain, a new question emerges. What else might be buried in New Mexico's vast, hot silence? Maybe something a little more ancient. Not gold this time, but something darker. Something that disappeared before we could even name it. If your brain's already buzzing with questions and we've only just begun, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And hey, while you're still here, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Are you deep into a 2 a.m. rabbit hole, or just getting started with your morning coffee? Let me know below. Lost Adams Diggings. There's a certain type of story that always starts with a stranger walking into a saloon. It's almost a cultural reflex at this point. Boots hit the floor, dust shakes loose, and the whole room freezes, as if they all instinctively know they're about to hear a tale that can't possibly end well. In 1864, in the New Mexico Territory, a man known only as Adams walked into one of these saloons. He looked rough, sunburned, and shaken in that special way reserved for people who've seen something they maybe shouldn't have. He had gold. Not flakes, not dust, nuggets, fist-sized, freshly dug. He said he knew where more of it was a lot more. And by the time the whiskey had been poured and the room had collectively leaned in, Adams started talking. He claimed he'd been part of a wagon party escorting a group of settlers through Arizona when they met an enigmatic Native American guide. The guide, for reasons that remain as unclear as the rest of the story, offered to show them a hidden canyon filled with gold. They followed, deep into the mountains, past markers, through narrow passes, into a shadowed gorge with towering cliffs and a stream that glittered not with water, but with wealth. They found it. The place. Adams said it was like stumbling into a fairy tale gold lying in the creek beds, embedded in the rock walls, enough to turn every man among them into a king. They set up camp and began to collect it. Days passed. The guide left, saying he'd return. He didn't. Then, the mood shifted. One night, Adams left camp to scout the nearby terrain. When he came back the next morning, everyone was dead. The details mercifully were scarce, but the implication was clear. Someone, or something, had protected the secret. Adams barely escaped with his life, and just a few precious samples of the gold. He tried to return later, of course, several times, but he could never find the canyon again. And so the story became what it was always destined to be, a legend. For over 150 years, prospectors, treasure hunters, and map-reading romantics have tried to retrace Adams's steps, and each of them, without exception, has failed. The canyon remains hidden. Maybe it collapsed. Maybe it was a metaphor. Maybe it was never real in the first place. But here's the unsettling part. Something about Adams's story rings almost true. He was a real person. He did show up with gold. He did seem genuinely traumatized by something. And while it's tempting to chalk it all up to fevered imagination or greed-fueled storytelling, even skeptical historians admit that Adams was not the usual kind of liar. He never got rich off the story. In fact, he spent the rest of his life obsessively trying to rediscover the place. He drew maps. He paid for expeditions. He wandered the mountains for decades until his body gave out. And when asked to describe the location, he always gave the same odd detail, that the canyon was shaped like a big U, and that the entrance was guarded by twin peaks, almost like gatekeepers carved by nature. Several locations have been proposed west of Magdalena, deep within the Mogollon Mountains, near the Arizona border, but none of them match the specifics. Some theorize that the canyon might have existed but was intentionally hidden again, its entrance caved in or wiped from any record. Others believe the story was a scrambled retelling of another lost mine, of which New Mexico seems to have dozens. Still, others argue the gold itself wasn't natural at all, but part of an old Spanish cache, possibly linked to 17th century missions or even abandoned Jesuit holdings. But there's always the feeling subtle, hard to shake, that someone knows. That somewhere in the bureaucratic mess of land surveys, military maps, and tribal lore, someone is sitting on a secret they don't want getting out. Maybe it's cultural preservation. Maybe it's something less noble. But the legend of the lost Adams diggings persists, not because people still think they'll find it, but because of what it represents. That for all our mapping, scanning, and satellite imagery, there are still corners of the world we cannot find again. And every once in a while, someone goes missing trying. Adams died in 1918, penniless and bitter. His final known sketch of the canyon was found folded in his coat, a crude drawing with arrows pointing to nothing and everything at once. One can only imagine how many nights he lay awake, replaying the route in his mind, turning the desert over again and again in his thoughts like a broken compass. But there's something deeply uncomfortable about this story that goes beyond gold or greed. It's the implication that some places don't want to be found. That nature, or fate, or whatever you want to call it, can erase a location the way a wave erases footprints in sand, quietly, permanently, without violence, but not without warning. And if the land can hide something as tangible as a gold mine, maybe it can also conceal something far stranger, like the surgical removal of cattle in the dead of night, their remains left with chilling precision. Because the next mystery doesn't glimmer in the sunlight, it glows under the radar. Cattle mutilations near Dulce. In the far north of New Mexico, tucked between the Jicarilla Apache Reservation and miles of mountainous, whisper-quiet wilderness, lies the small town of Dulce. It's the kind of place where the land feels older than the sky, and silence doesn't just settle, it watches. For most of its existence, Dulce was exactly what it appeared to be. A quiet town built on ancestral ground, shaped by ranching, tradition, and the kind of remote calm that either heals the soul or unnerves it completely. Then, in the 1972nd, the cattle started turning up. Wrong. It began slowly. A few ranchers would find one of their cows dead in the field. No obvious wounds, no signs of predators, just dead. But then, things got stranger. The animals weren't simply lifeless, they were altered. Precise cuts, missing organs, no blood, no tracks, no struggle, nothing that suggested any natural explanation. Local rancher Manuel Gomez was among the first to speak publicly. In 1976, he found one of his prized cattle lying in an open field near Dulce. What disturbed him wasn't just that the animal was dead, it was that its body seemed to have been subjected to something clinical, Its ear was removed, an eye was gone. The rectal area had been cored out with almost surgical precision, but there were no tool marks, no predator signs, no blood, and no explanation. The body wasn't torn, it was edited. And this kept happening, again and again. Cattle across the region, and not just in Dulce, but across New Mexico, Colorado, and the greater Southwest were discovered in similar conditions. Always the same eerie details. Always the same absence of evidence. The only consistency was the inconsistency and the cold, precise nature of the damage. Naturally, theories flooded in like water through a cracked dam. Some blamed cults, others pointed to covert military operations, but the theory that stuck hardest, partly because it was the least believable, was extraterrestrials. More specifically, aliens performing biological experiments using cattle as test subjects. A chilling idea, made worse by the unsettling pattern. No signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, no predators scared off by human scent. Just open plains, clean incisions, and silence. The FBI and other federal agencies got involved, sort of. They looked into it, issued a few reports. The 1979 Rommel report, written by FBI agent Kenneth Rommel, concluded there was no evidence of anything paranormal or government-related. The cause? Natural predators and decomposition. Case closed. Except, the ranchers didn't buy it. Not then, not now. Because what kind of predator removes a cow's lips, ears, and tongue with laser-like precision in the middle of the night, leaves no tracks, and manages to drain the body of blood without disturbing the surrounding ground? What kind of natural decomposition carves a nearly perfect circle around a missing organ while leaving the carcass otherwise untouched? The local community began to suspect that something was being hidden, something just outside of grasp. Some even speculated that the cattle weren't the target, but the message, a kind of quiet warning, a demonstration. The point wasn't that the cows were mutilated, it was that nothing could be done about it. Then, of course, came the rumors about the Dulce base. According to long-standing conspiracy lore, there's a secret underground facility beneath the Archuleta Mesa outside of Dulce, allegedly a joint operation between the U.S. government and extraterrestrial entities. Most mainstream outlets dismiss it as pure sci-fi paranoia, but the timing is odd. The base rumors began to circulate not long after the cattle mutilations reached their peak. Former State Trooper Gabe Valdez, who investigated multiple cases, reported strange aircraft, unmarked helicopters, and radiation traces around mutilation sites. He believed something was happening, he just couldn't say what. Valdez never claimed aliens were responsible. In fact, he leaned toward clandestine government testing, but his files revealed a disturbing through line. All the mutilated cattle had been tagged and tracked. Someone knew which animals to take. Someone had access, and someone had the means to remove organs without being seen. But here's the part that sticks like a thorn under the skin. The phenomenon didn't stop. It still happens. Quietly. Less frequently, maybe. But the pattern never fully disappeared. Ranchers today will still tell you off the record that sometimes their animals go missing, and when they show up, it's always the same. Clean, bloodless, wrong. The real mystery isn't just who or what is responsible, it's why the story has no ending, why the pattern refuses to break. And why, even now, in the age of drones and satellites, no one's been able to catch whoever or whatever is doing it. So the land watches, the ranchers wait, and the sky above Dulce stays unusually quiet. But the mystery doesn't stop at the edge of town, because in the same stretch of desert, a child once vanished from her home without a trace, then possibly called a year later from a payphone no one could find. And her voice? They say it sounded like she was still 9 years old. Disappearance of Antoinette Calladito. Gallup, New Mexico, is not the kind of place where things go unnoticed. It's small, intimate, a city where everyone seems to know everyone else's business, whether they want to or not. It's a place of resilience bordering the Navajo Nation, rich in culture, long histories, and quiet strength. But in 1986, it became the setting for a mystery so painful, so hauntingly unresolved, that even the desert air around it seems reluctant to speak. Antoinette Christine Calladito was 9 years old when she vanished. She lived with her mother, Penny, and 2 younger sisters in a modest home on Arnold Street. It was the kind of neighborhood where kids played on the sidewalk and doors were left unlocked until they weren't. The night of the 5th of April, 1986, Antoinette had gone to bed after a normal evening. Nothing was out of the ordinary. Her mother had allowed her to stay up a bit later than usual watching television, helping out, doing what responsible kids do. When Penny woke up the next morning, Antoinette was gone. At first, there was hope. Maybe she'd gone to a friend's house. Maybe she'd wandered outside. But hope curdled quickly into fear. The front door had been locked. The younger sisters said they heard a knock during the night. A man's voice. Antoinette had answered it. And then, nothing. What followed was a search that never really ended. Flyers, neighborhood canvases, psychic consultations, FBI involvement. Leads came in like rain brief, hard to catch, evaporating just as quickly. One tip stood out above the rest. A phone call received by a Gallup police dispatcher roughly a year after Antoinette vanished. The call was from a young girl. She said her name was Antoinette. She said she was in Albuquerque. She was being held against her will. Then a man's voice cut in. The line went dead. The call was recorded. Investigators believed the voice could have been hers. Penny believed it was her daughter, but the payphone couldn't be traced. No location was ever confirmed. It was like the child had reached through the static for a single second, and then disappeared again into the fog. Then came the restaurant story. A waitress, working in Carson City, Nevada, told police that a few years after the disappearance, a group came in 2 adults and a young girl. The child seemed nervous, withdrawn. At one point, when the adults weren't looking, she allegedly dropped a napkin on the floor. The waitress picked it up after they left. Scrawled in shaky handwriting were 4 words: "Help me. Call police." Again, unconfirmed. No name was attached to the note. Surveillance footage, if it existed, was never released. It's one of those leads that floats forever in the margins of the case file, possible, plausible, but unprovable. Antoinette's mother, Penny, never stopped believing her daughter was alive. She appeared on national television, pleaded with the public, and insisted that her child hadn't just wandered off. She believed Antoinette had been taken targeted, even. But despite her efforts, the case eventually grew cold, then colder, then frostbitten. Penny died in 1999 without answers, and so the silence remains. What makes Antoinette's disappearance so disturbingly unique isn't just the initial vanishing, it's the echoes, the call, the napkin, the haunting possibility that she lived for years after the headlines had moved on, that she might have aged, grown up, even walked among us unnoticed, all while carrying the memory of a door that should never have opened. The uncomfortable truth is that Gallup isn't Las Vegas. It's not saturated with surveillance cameras, massive search teams, or non-stop media coverage. In 1986, the resources were minimal, and the infrastructure for finding missing indigenous children because Antoinette was of Navajo descent was practically non-existent. That part of the story often gets buried under the more sensational elements. But it matters. A lot. Because Antoinette was not the only child to vanish from that region. She became a symbol not of a single mystery, but of many. Of systems that failed. Of voices that weren't heard. Of cases that didn't get press conferences or task forces. Her name, now whispered alongside the missing and murdered indigenous women and girls, movement, stands not just for one disappearance, but for a pattern. And yet, despite all this, her story never entirely disappeared. There are online forums where strangers still try to track down clues. There are retired agents who still carry her file. There are psychics, skeptics, journalists, and neighbors who revisit her story again and again, as if rereading it will make the ending finally change. But it hasn't. And perhaps the most haunting part? Her voice is still out there. That phone call just a few seconds long captured a kind of pain that refuses to be filed away. It is the voice of a child caught in limbo, not just between cities, but between belief and bureaucracy. A voice that cried out once, clearly, then vanished into static. And while most people look to the skies when they think of New Mexico's most famous abductions, this one happened at ground level, in a house, in a town, to a girl whose name is remembered more by strangers than by systems. But the mystery of a missing child is different from most. It leaves behind an emotional residue, an unfinished sentence that hovers in the air. Just like another case, not far from Gallup. Another young woman. Another bicycle ride into daylight that turned to silence. Another photo that may or may not have meant something. Because the desert doesn't just take. Sometimes, it shows you what you're missing just enough to keep you chasing it. Disappearance of Tara Calico. It was the 20th of September, 1988, and the sun had barely risen over Belen, New Mexico. Tara Leigh Calico, 19 years old, borrowed her mother's pink Huffy bicycle and set out along her usual route on Highway 47. She told her mother she'd be back by noon. They had plans to play tennis. She was punctual like that, always was. That day, though, she never came back. The road she traveled was familiar, flat, sun-drenched, lined with dry brush and low fences. It was part of her daily ritual, a stretch of isolation that had become routine. But that day, something interrupted the routine. Witnesses would later report seeing Tara biking along the highway, followed closely by a light-colored pickup truck. A few said the truck had a camper shell. No one saw what happened after that. Her mother, Patty Duell, knew something was wrong almost immediately. She drove the route herself, searching the roadside, scanning for signs, anything at all. By evening, the police were involved. Search parties combed the area. What they found was troubling in a quiet, understated way. Pieces of Tara's Sony Walkman, a cassette tape, fragments left along the road, as if dropped deliberately. Her mother believed they were clues, breadcrumbs Tara had tried to leave behind in the seconds before everything changed. Law enforcement wasn't so sure. Then the silence began. Days passed, then weeks. The media attention picked up slightly enough to keep the pressure on, but not enough to crack anything open. The theories came and went. Abduction, accident, runaway. None of them fit quite right. Tara wasn't reckless. She was planning to go to college. She was known, loved, and entirely uncharacteristic of someone who would simply vanish without a trace. The timing, the circumstances, the silence, it all felt wrong. And then, almost a year later, the photo surfaced. It was found in a Florida convenience store parking lot. Polaroid film, undeveloped, and dropped on the blacktop near a white van. A shopper picked it up, curious. What she saw shocked her. In the photo, a teenage girl and a young boy, both bound, their mouths taped. They were lying on what looked like a bed, in the back of a van or trailer. Behind them, faintly visible, were a few objects, books, a blanket, what might have been medical supplies. The woman who found the photo immediately contacted police. It was broadcast nationwide within days. Tara's mother believed the girl in the photo was her daughter, not just because of the resemblance, but because of a scar on her leg, one that matched Tara's garter. The boy was believed to resemble Michael Henley, another New Mexico child who had gone missing earlier that year. For a moment, everything stopped. This could have been it, a breakthrough. But the photo raised more questions than it answered. Where was it taken? Why was it left in that parking lot? Who took it and why? The FBI analyzed the photo, so did Scotland Yard, and eventually Los Alamos National Laboratory. Their conclusions were mixed. Some believed the girl was Tara, others weren't convinced. It remained, like so much else in this case, frozen in ambiguity. Years later, Michael Henley's remains were found in the Zuni Mountains, just a few miles from where he'd disappeared while on a camping trip. That discovery seemed to rule him out as the boy in the photo. But Tara's fate remained unknown. Her family never stopped looking, never stopped pressing. Her mother made media appearances, pushed for federal involvement, hired private investigators. She became, unwillingly, an expert in how the system forgets certain cases while endlessly rehashing others. In 2008, 20 years after Tara vanished, 2 local law enforcement officers claimed that they had information pointing to what really happened. According to their statements, Tara had been followed and struck by 2 men she knew, who panicked, took her, and later tried to cover up the incident. But the claims were anonymous. No names were given. No charges were filed. The theory faded into the background noise of the case, another maybe in a sea of almosts. What lingers about Tara's story isn't just the horror of the disappearance. It's the sheer discomfort of the maybe, the photo, the dropped cassette, the almost recognizable truck. A life interrupted not with violence, but with silence. The kind of absence that gnaws at the edges of memory, reminding you that something is still unfinished. And there's something especially unsettling about a mystery that offers you glimpses just enough to keep you believing but never delivers resolution. Tara's life wasn't swallowed all at once. It was erased inch by inch, clue by clue, until only the outline remained. That outline now sits among thousands of cold cases, but her name still sparks unease, especially for those who've ridden that same stretch of highway. Because she isn't just missing, she's still missing. Which is worse? And if you think the answers might lie in a witness, a suspect, or a confession, well, you're not alone. But some mysteries don't offer suspects. Some offer crowds, gunfire, dozens of witnesses. And still no justice, no resolution, just an open door and a blood trail no one ever followed far enough. Las Cruces Bowling Alley Massacre. There are certain crimes that seem too messy to stay unsolved, too loud, too public, too bold to simply fade into the back rooms of police filing cabinets and cold case archives. But then there's the Las Cruces Bowling Alley Massacre, a case so brazen, so bewildering, that its very visibility has become its shadow. The 10th of February, 1990, a Saturday morning. Las Cruces, New Mexico. The day began like any other for the folks at Las Cruces Bowl, a family-owned establishment where the soundtrack was pins crashing, kids running down aisles, and the soft hum of fluorescent lights reflecting off rental shoes. It was a local staple, the kind of place that didn't feel like the kind of place where horror lives. And maybe that's why what happened there still doesn't make any sense. At approximately 8:30 a.m., 2 men entered through the unlocked back door. Not in a rush, not chaotic, calm, collected. They carried firearms and purpose. In the building at the time were the manager, her daughter, her daughter's friend, a cook, a pin mechanic, and a child 12 years old. The intruders herded them into the office, demanded money from the safe, and seemed to be operating under the assumption that this was just a robbery, fast, in and out. But it wasn't. Something went sideways. Or maybe the plan was never just robbery. Witnesses, some of whom would survive, reported that after taking the money, the men forced all 7 victims to lie on the floor. Then they opened fire. At close range. No masks, no attempt to hide their faces, no hesitation. It was as if the violence was part of the plan from the beginning. 3 of the victims died at the scene. Others were gravely injured. One, a little girl, was airlifted to a hospital but didn't make it. The surviving victims, remarkably, managed to call 911 and give partial descriptions. The assailants were described as 2 Hispanic males, one older, one younger, calm demeanor. One possibly had a mustache. That was about all anyone could agree on. The police response was rapid, but the trail was already cold. Despite the brutality and public nature of the crime, the assailants vanished. No fingerprints, no DNA, no security footage. This was 1990. After all, the bowling alley didn't have cameras. No usable leads. Just chaos, trauma, and stunned disbelief. And from that moment on, the case seemed to fall into a pattern that's disturbingly familiar in cases like this. Confusion, media attention, public pressure, official statements, dead ends, and eventually, silence. Over the years, there were theories. Maybe it was a gang initiation. Maybe it was a hit gone wrong. Maybe someone inside knew something or owed something, but none of it stuck. The survivors gave consistent statements, and the community gave what tips they could. Every few years, new sketches were released, new age-progressed images of what the suspects might look like today. They're chilling, but mostly because they make you realize how easily these men could have melted into anonymity. They could have been someone's neighbor, someone's coworker, someone's dad. There's something especially sinister about crimes committed in broad daylight. Something about the casualness, the defiance. These weren't shadowy figures lurking in the night. They walked in like customers. They left like smoke. And the investigation, while extensive, never seemed to land anywhere definitive. Interviews with law enforcement decades later often carry a tone of weary frustration. Everything was almost a match. Almost a clue. Almost a breakthrough. The community, too, never fully recovered. How could it? A bowling alley is a sacred space of sorts where kids go on field trips, where parents host birthday parties, where neighbors compete in leagues. Turning that into a crime scene felt like a violation of reality itself. It's the kind of event that sours innocence and teaches you, without permission, that safety is a fragile illusion. And here's where it gets worse. This case should have been solved. It had eyewitnesses. It had a timestamp. It had faces. It had a location. It was loud, messy, and left ripples across the entire city. The fact that it remains unsolved is less a mystery and more of a slow burn indictment of the limitations of forensic science at the time, of investigative missteps, of how quickly the justice system can lose focus when the trail goes cold. But maybe the most haunting part of all is how thoroughly these two men vanished. Not just physically, but psychically. No reliable confessions, no matching crimes in other states. Just a permanent gap in logic, a silence where answers should be. And yet, even that silence feels familiar now, eerily so. Because not far from Las Cruces, just a few years earlier, another man stood alone in the New Mexico desert and reported something strange. Something above, a craft, a figure, a moment that rewrote his understanding of the world in broad daylight. And no matter how many official explanations followed, none of them ever felt quite right. Lonnie Zamora, UFO sighting. On the 24th of April, 1964, Officer Lonnie Zamora of the Socorro Police Department was chasing a speeding car on the outskirts of town when he heard something unusual, an explosive roar, followed by a sharp burst of light in the distance. He stopped the pursuit and veered off the main road, following the sound. What he found in the scrubby desert landscape outside Socorro would become one of the most perplexing and meticulously investigated UFO sightings in American history. Zamora wasn't the kind of man given to flights of fancy. By all accounts, he was grounded, practical, and a little gruff, the kind of guy who dealt with speeding tickets and minor town squabbles, not unexplained aerial phenomena. And yet, when he crested a small hill, he saw something that made him stop cold. There, in the middle of the arroyo, was a craft, oval-shaped, metallic, resting on 4 slender landing legs. Next to it stood 2 small figures in white coveralls, human-shaped, but strange. He would later describe them as normal-sized adults, but small, adding that they looked startled, like they hadn't expected company. Zamora froze. Then the figures disappeared, whether into the craft or behind it, he couldn't be sure. Seconds later, the object emitted a high-pitched whine, extended flames from its underside, lifted into the air, and took off silently into the bright blue sky. This wasn't a fleeting light in the distance, or a blurry object captured on shaky film. This was a close-range encounter, with physical impressions left in the dirt, scorched brush, and a seasoned police officer visibly shaken. By the time backup arrived, the craft was long gone. But the landing marks remained. Within hours, the site was crawling with officials, the FBI, the Air Force, scientists. Investigators from Project Blue Book, the government's official UFO inquiry program, arrived soon after and conducted a full analysis. And unlike so many other sightings, this one left behind evidence: 4 depressions in the ground, arranged in a symmetrical pattern, burnt vegetation consistent with an intense heat source, and most importantly, a witness who stuck to his story under intense scrutiny. Zamora never wavered, not once. Not under pressure from his superiors, not under questioning by federal agents, not under the growing media attention that would eventually turn Socorro into a minor pilgrimage site for UFO enthusiasts. His story remained calm, consistent, and deeply unsettling. The Air Force, after exhaustive interviews and testing, labeled the case unexplained. That word carries a strange weight in government terminology. It doesn't mean dismissed. It means we have no idea. Various explanations were offered in the years that followed, all of them deeply unsatisfying. Some suggested it was a hoax, though none could explain how Zamora faked scorch marks in the desert or orchestrated a low-flying craft with a realistic flame exhaust. Others claimed it was a test of a lunar lander prototype, despite the fact that no such test was scheduled or reported in the area, and none matched the description. Then there was the weather balloon theory, which has become the default shrug emoji of unexplained aerial events. But again, there was no balloon, no wreckage, and no explanation for the maneuverability of the object Zamora described. The deeper truth here is less about what was seen, and more about how it was received. You had an honest cop with no reason to lie, no interest in fame, and no history of fantasy. You had physical evidence. You had government involvement, and still, nothing. The sighting didn't destroy Zamora's life, but it didn't leave it untouched either. He grew weary of the attention, stopped giving interviews, refused to cash in on the fame that could have followed. He retired quietly, settled into obscurity, and rarely spoke of the event again. It wasn't just what he saw that disturbed him. It was what it meant that there are things in the sky, and possibly on the ground, that we're not meant to understand. Or worse, that someone understands them and just isn't saying. Over the years, the Socorro sighting has gained a strange, almost religious aura in the UFO community. Not because it's the flashiest or most sensational, but because it's clean. Uncluttered by hoaxes, free from the usual noise. It's one man's honest account, supported by measurable impact, surrounded by silence. Even skeptics struggle with this one. No motive, no inconsistency, no debunking that doesn't require more imagination than the event itself. If Zamora didn't see what he claimed, then we're left with something just as bizarre. A law enforcement officer manufacturing an elaborate event in broad daylight for absolutely no gain. So what did he see? Something built, something engineered, something that didn't belong to the desert and probably didn't belong to the era. A craft that came, hovered, and left its presence marked only by burnt sage and an officer's rattled memory. And what's most disconcerting is how tidy the whole thing island it came. It went, it left no trace except one. Which brings us to another kind of mystery. Not one that burned the bushes or bent the grass, but one that hums just beneath the earth's surface. A sound without a source. Heard by some, denied by others, and studied to the edge of reason without any real conclusion. Because sometimes, the loudest mysteries are the ones no one else can hear. Taos hum. Taos, New Mexico, is one of those places that looks like it was dreamed into existence. An artist's colony surrounded by desert mesas, snow-capped peaks, and adobe buildings that seem to rise organically from the earth. It's a landscape that feels ancient, timeless, even. The kind of place where silence isn't just common, it's sacred, which makes it all the more ironic that Taos is home to one of the most baffling sound-related phenomena in the modern world. Because in this serene desert town, hundreds of residents and visitors alike have reported hearing something. Not a song, not a voice, not even a machine, just a low, constant hum, barely audible. Always there, never traced. The Taos hum. It's not loud, it's not rhythmic, and it's not something you can record, no matter how much high-end audio equipment you drag into the hills. People describe it as a low-frequency rumble, like a distant diesel engine idling just below the range of detection. It's often strongest at night, and curiously, it's mostly heard indoors. Step outside, and the hum often disappears, if only for a moment. But here's where it gets weird. Not everyone hears it. In fact, only about 2% of the population in affected areas seem to be able to perceive the hum. These hearers, as some researchers call them, are otherwise ordinary. They don't suffer from tinnitus. They're not hallucinating. They're not chasing UFOs or dabbling in fringe science. They're teachers, artists, retirees, tourists, engineers. And they all describe the same low-frequency, invasive presence. It's not just annoying. For many, it's maddening. The first major reports began surfacing in the early 1992, though locals insist it had been around long before that, just unspoken, unexamined, folded into the mythos of the land like everything else. As the hum gained attention, researchers from Los Alamos National Laboratory, the University of New Mexico, and various independent sound engineers descended upon Taos with microphones, sensors, and open minds. They found nothing. No unusual frequencies, no consistent mechanical sources, no traceable sound patterns, nothing that could explain what these people were experiencing. But the reports kept coming, and not just in Taos. Similar hums have been documented in Bristol, England, Kokomo, Indiana, Largs, Scotland, and even Auckland, New Zealand. Different continents, same story. Which leads to the central contradiction. How can a sound exist that can't be recorded? How can it affect one person and not the person standing right next to them? And perhaps most unsettling, what does it mean when a place famous for its silence becomes defined by a sound no one can prove? Naturally, the theories are as numerous as they are strange. Some point to industrial sources, unidentified fans, distant generators, underground pipes, or power transformers, but those would be detectable, and once shut off, the hum should stop. It doesn't. Others blame the military. Taos is within driving distance of several military installations, including the previously mentioned White Sands missile range. Could the hum be the byproduct of a classified energy project? A low-frequency radar? Elf waves? HARP experiments? Of course, there are those who lean toward the metaphysical. Some believe the hum is a side effect of Earth's own natural frequency, something in the Schumann resonance spectrum, picked up subconsciously by those with unusually sensitive hearing. Others believe it's not sound at all, but a form of low-frequency electromagnetic radiation that the human brain translates as hum, a vibration of the nervous system, not the eardrum. A psychosomatic experience rooted in environmental factors we haven't even named yet. And then there's the alien hypothesis, that the hum is a signal possibly accidental, possibly deliberate from something not of this earth. Not a message exactly, just a bleed-through. A frequency meant for someone else, received by us. But here's the thing. Most people who hear the hum aren't looking for a conspiracy. They're looking for sleep, for peace, for silence. Some leave Taos altogether, driven out by a noise no one else believes in. Others stay, investing in soundproof rooms, meditation, or white noise machines to drown out a phenomenon that science still classifies as unexplained. In 1993, Congress even got involved. Then Representative Bill Richardson pushed for a formal investigation into the hum. The result? A comprehensive report, with no conclusions. The scientists confirmed that a real sound was being perceived, but they couldn't say what it was, where it came from, or why it affected only some people. The Taos hum remains a riddle because it defies the basic rules of sound. It has no source, no footprint, no clean ending. It just island, a sound that shouldn't exist in a town defined by quiet. And if you stand alone in the hills outside Taos, you'll hear nothing but wind, birds, and the occasional far-off bark of a dog. But some people standing in that same silence will swear something else is there. A vibration under the ground, a signal in the air, a question you can't unhear. But perhaps that's the nature of the mysteries in New Mexico, the ones that aren't loud but persistent. And sometimes, what hums beneath the ground turns out to be far older, stranger, and more unsettling than we expect, especially when the ground belongs to a legend, one that never found rest, even in death. Or maybe because of what happened after it. Geronimo's skull. In the sun-baked terrain of the Southwest, certain legends refuse to die. Some are passed down in whispered stories around campfires. Others are etched in history books with names and dates and battlefields. But few are as unsettling or as oddly persistent as the one that claims the skull of Geronimo, the famous Apache leader, was stolen after his death and now resides in the crypt of Yale's secret society, Skull and Bones. On the surface, it sounds like a campus ghost story, the kind of tall tale passed around late at night in ivy-covered dormitories. But the deeper you go, the more the story twists into something far more disturbing and far harder to dismiss. Geronimo was a fierce and complex figure, a Bedonkohe Apache warrior who fought against both Mexican and U.S. expansion into tribal lands. He became a symbol of resistance, rebellion, and survival. For decades, he evaded capture across the deserts and mountains of the Southwest, carving his legacy into the land with an almost mythical tenacity. But in 1886, he finally surrendered for the last time. He was imprisoned, paraded, photographed, and ultimately died as a prisoner of war at Fort Sill, Oklahoma in 1909. He was buried in the Apache cemetery there, under a simple stone and the kind of silence that rarely accompanies someone who once shook empires. That should have been the end of the story. But in 1918, 9 years after his death, the legend begins. A letter surfaced, written by Prescott Bush, father of one future U.S. president and grandfather of another. In it, he allegedly detailed a grave robbery. He and other members of Yale's Skull and Bones Society had, according to the story, stolen Geronimo's skull, along with some bones and personal artifacts, and brought them back to Yale's New Haven campus to be stored in their notorious tomb, the Society's windowless temple-like headquarters. Now, there's something almost cartoonishly gothic about the image. Elite college students, digging up a warrior's grave under the cover of darkness, smuggling his remains across the country, and locking them away in a room lined with other artifacts and obscure symbols. But that's the thing about legends like this, they stick because they're just plausible enough to be horrifying. Prescott Bush was indeed a member of Skull and Bones. So were many members of his inner circle. The society has long been known for its obsession with death, ritual, and the macabre. Members are required to confess their deepest secrets upon initiation. The society collects relics, some historical, some ceremonial. Their headquarters is notoriously off-limits. No photos, no tours. Just rumor. And then, in 2006, the story erupted again. Harlan Geronimo, the great-grandson of the Apache leader, filed a lawsuit against Yale University, Skull and Bones, and even the U.S. government, demanding the return of his ancestors' remains. He wanted Geronimo reburied near the Gila Wilderness in New Mexico, his birthplace. But to do that, he needed confirmation. Proof that the bones were, in fact, stolen. Proof that they even existed. None was offered. Skull and Bones, for their part, didn't deny the story outright. They didn't confirm it, either. Yale distanced itself, claiming no control over the society's private rituals or property. The U.S. government, when pressed, responded with the bureaucratic equivalent of a shrug. The suit was eventually dismissed, but the legend refused to quiet down. In 2009, a photograph surfaced. Grainy, monochrome, seemingly from the early 20th century. In it, a skull rested inside a glass case marked Geronimo. Whether the photo was real, doctored, or symbolic remains contested, but the visual power of it reignited the debate. And here's the uncomfortable part. If it is true, it wouldn't be the only time indigenous remains were stolen, displayed, or locked away in private collections. Museums across the U.S. have only recently begun to repatriate Native American remains and sacred items. The desecration of burial sites, whether for science, curiosity, or ritual, has a long, shameful history. So even if the Skull and Bones story seems outrageous, it fits a larger pattern. One where the powerful take what they want, cloak it in secrecy, and dare history to call their bluff. And that's what makes this mystery so persistently disturbing. It's not just about whether Geronimo's skull is in a secret tomb. It's about why someone would want it there in the first place. Is it power? Symbolism? Control? What does it mean to steal the head of a man who refused to kneel? To this day, the grave in Fort Sill remains unguarded, unproven, and unresolved. The secret society remains silent. The skull, if it ever was stolen, remains sealed behind stone and ritual. And the desert, once again, offers no answers. Just wind, just dust, just the quiet certainty that some legacies refuse to be buried. But maybe it's fitting that this mystery leads directly into one of New Mexico's most enduring legends, one that doesn't require secret societies or lawsuits, just a river, a weeping woman, and the sound of grief echoing through the canyons long after the stories should have stopped. La Llorona. The story begins with a woman and a river. That's how it always begins. The details change, the setting shifts, but the shape of the tale remains the same, like water poured into a new container. In New Mexico, La Llorona is more than a ghost story. She's a presence, a sound, a warning, a lesson whispered through generations, told in the voice of your abuela, half in caution and half in superstition, as if the boundary between them doesn't really matter. They say you can hear her near the Rio Grande, especially late at night when the wind dies down and the sky leans close. She cries for her children, always for her children. A wail stretched across time, a mourning so deep it transcends death. And if you hear it, if you really hear it, then it's already too late. Of course, every region has its own variation. In some tellings, La Llorona was once a beautiful young woman named Maria, caught between poverty and desire. She fell in love with a wealthy man who gave her everything except permanence. When he left her, she broke, and in her grief, she turned on her own children, committing the unthinkable. When she realized what she had done, she was consumed by guilt and walked into the river, letting the current claim her. Now, she walks the banks forever. Not quite dead, not quite alive, searching, wailing, punishing. It's a tale meant to frighten children into obedience. Don't go out after dark. Don't wander near the water. Don't talk to strangers. But La Llorona isn't just about fear. She's about grief, regret, the kind of sorrow that sticks in your bones long after the story ends. What makes her different in New Mexico is how real she feels. This isn't a ghost confined to folklore books or bedtime stories. People claim to have seen her, heard her, felt her presence. And not just in quiet moments of solitude, but in crowded places, driving down rural roads, walking near canals. There are reports of her appearing in mirrors, in rear-view windows, on hiking trails just outside of Albuquerque. Her voice is always the same, drawn out, mournful, and filled with a kind of hopelessness that seeps into the air. "My children," she cries, "mis hijos." And people don't just see her, they experience her. There are entire families who swear the electricity in their house went dead just before the sound of weeping began. Others tell of dreams that aren't quite dreams, encounters in sleep that leave water on the floorboards or the smell of wet reeds in the air. One woman reported hearing sobs outside her bedroom window for 5 nights straight. Each night, they got closer. Then they stopped. Her husband never believed her. He passed away 3 months later under mysterious circumstances. Coincidence? Maybe. But that's not the kind of word that holds much power in these stories. And then there's the academic side of it. Folklorists have tried for decades to pin La Llorona down to explain her as a cultural archetype, a tragic maternal figure rooted in colonial trauma. Some argue she represents the violent collision between Spanish settlers and indigenous peoples. Her story, a fragmented echo of La Malinche, the Nahua woman who acted as both interpreter and consort to Hernán Cortés. Others see her as a cautionary echo of Medea, or a manifestation of collective guilt projected onto the land through generations of displacement, betrayal, and sorrow. But those are just theories. The desert doesn't care much for academic frameworks. What matters to the people who live here isn't why she exists, it's that she does. New Mexico is full of landscapes that seem to carry memory. The canyons remember, the rivers do too. And if you've ever stood near the Rio Grande at night when the wind calms and the stars stretch wider than they should, you understand how easily sound travels, and how easily belief fills the gaps. La Llorona is a story that survives not just because it's told, but because it refuses to leave. Even now, children in Española and Las Cruces are told not to wander too close to the water after dark. Road signs are bent in her direction. Murals bear her image beautiful, sorrowful, often faceless. Her myth is a kind of emotional infrastructure, built into the cultural memory of the Southwest like adobe into earth. And the unease she brings isn't just about ghosts. It's about what we carry when we think no one's watching. The guilt that haunts, the grief that lingers. The idea that some wounds aren't healed by time but by water, cold, flowing, and waiting. But La Llorona isn't the only mystery in New Mexico that involves architecture that defies explanation and a lingering sense that something divine or inhuman left fingerprints behind. Because just a few hundred miles away, tucked into a small chapel in Santa Fe, a staircase spirals upward in a way that should be impossible. No nails, no supports, no blueprints. Just the lingering possibility that maybe, just maybe, someone or something answered a carpenter's prayer. Loreto Chapel's miraculous staircase. In the heart of Santa Fe, tucked into a quiet corner just off the city's main plaza, stands the Loreto Chapel, a Gothic revival church that looks like it was airlifted out of 19th century France and dropped into the American Southwest by mistake. It's beautiful, but modest, humble in its design, and if you walked past it without knowing what was inside, you'd probably assume it was just another charming old building wrapped in the aesthetic nostalgia of New Mexico's eclectic religious history. But inside, behind its heavy wooden doors and beneath the soft filtered light of stained glass windows, is a staircase that shouldn't exist. It spirals upward in a perfect double helix, twisting 360 degrees, unsupported by any central column, with no visible means of structural stability. It's made entirely of wood, no nails, no metal fasteners, just wooden pegs. It rises 20 feet from the chapel floor to the choir loft above, elegant and seamless, like it was grown rather than built. They call it the miraculous staircase, and for good reason. The story goes like this. In 1878, the Sisters of Loretto were left with a dilemma. The chapel had been constructed without access to the choir loft, and due to the chapel's small size and unique dimensions, conventional staircase solutions were ruled out. There simply wasn't enough room for a standard set of stairs, and a ladder was deemed unsafe for the aging nuns. So, the sisters did what nuns do: they prayed. Specifically, they prayed a novena to St. Joseph, the patron saint of carpenters. On the 9th and final day, a man appeared at their door, a mysterious carpenter. He was modest, soft-spoken, and carried nothing but simple tools. He offered to build them a staircase, asked for no pay, no lodging, and said he would need complete privacy while he worked. They agreed. He disappeared into the chapel for several days, emerging only when the work was complete. Then, as suddenly as he had arrived, he vanished. No thanks, no invoice, no name. Just the staircase. When the sisters examined the finished work, they were stunned, not just by the craftsmanship, but by the physics. The staircase had no visible support, no central beam. It made 2 full revolutions without any attachment to the surrounding walls, and somehow it held. It still holds, nearly 150 years later. Word of the miracle spread quickly. Architects and engineers came to inspect it. Many marveled, some tried to debunk. But to this day, no one can fully explain how the staircase supports its own weight, let alone the weight of those who walk on it. The wood used in its construction is also an oddity. It's not native to the region. In fact, it's not native to the United States. Some tests suggest it's a type of spruce found only in certain remote regions of Europe. No shipping records, no local lumber orders, no paper trail at all. Of course, skeptics have their theories. Some suggest that the staircase does have a central support hidden within the wood itself. A clever illusion, they say. Others argue that the design is simply rare, not impossible. Spiral staircases have existed in Europe for centuries, but even they admit that the lack of nails and the absence of conventional bracing makes this one particularly strange. And then there's the identity of the carpenter. Over the years, several names have been proposed, none confirmed. Some say it was a traveling French artisan. Others think it was a member of a reclusive religious order with a vow of anonymity. A few go further, suggesting, only half-jokingly, that it was St. Joseph himself. After all, the timing was too perfect, the craftsmanship too precise, the disappearance too complete. But that's the nature of sacred mysteries. They exist in the space between fact and faith, between what we can measure and what we simply feel. Today, the Loretto Chapel is no longer a consecrated church. It's privately owned, a museum of sorts, a wedding venue, a place where people light candles and leave with more questions than answers. The staircase remains untouched. No one has altered or reinforced it. Out of respect, or maybe fear, or maybe superstition, it creaks slightly under the weight of footsteps, but never buckles. And maybe that's the point. In an age of blueprints, regulations, and engineering software, the staircase still defies explanation. It's not flashy. It doesn't levitate. It doesn't glow in the dark. But it shouldn't be able to do what it does. And yet, it does it anyway. That subtle, quiet impossibility is what keeps people coming back. Not to figure it out, necessarily, but to feel it. To stand in its presence and let that old, familiar shiver creep down the spine. The one that whispers, there's something else here. And maybe the most unsettling thing about it is how ordinary the miracle looks. Just polished wood and gravity holding hands. No fireworks, no chorus. Just a structure that shouldn't stand, and yet does. But if you think that's the strangest thing hidden in New Mexico's forests, think again. Because just a few miles away, people have reported something far more primal wandering through the trees. Not a ghost. Not a saint. Something taller, hairier, and a lot less cooperative. The half-man. Bigfoot sightings. Somewhere deep in the forests of northern New Mexico, far from the adobe churches and roadside shrines, there's a trail where the trees grow too thick and the silence presses in like a held breath. It's the kind of place that makes your skin bristle for no good reason. No cell signal, no clear path, just you in the woods, dense, old, and maybe not as empty as they seem. Because if the reports are to be believed, and there are many, you might not be alone out there. They call him many things. The half-man, the hairy man, Sasquatch, Bigfoot. But in New Mexico, especially in the forested regions around the Jemez Mountains, the San Juan National Forest, and the Sangre de Cristos, the stories have their own regional flavor. Less Pacific Northwest, more high desert shadow. Less campfire entertainment, more whispered warning. These aren't just distant shapes seen at twilight or blurry blobs in shaky videos. Some of the reports here are close, personal, and chilling. One man in Dulce, a place already soaked in otherworldly lore, swore he saw it while hunting. Not far off, not through binoculars, 20 yards away. It was tall, he said, at least 7 feet, with matted hair and an unmistakably humanoid gait. It didn't run when it saw him. It just stared. And then it vanished into the trees with an eerie calm that felt less like fear and more like understanding. Another account from the early 2002 came from a group of campers near the Pecos Wilderness. They described hearing heavy footfalls circling their tent at night. No bear, they insisted. No elk. Something that walked upright. The next morning, they found enormous footprints around the campsite, deep impressions in the pine needles. Too deep, they claimed, to be human. Too deliberate to be a hoax. And then there's the scent. Many who report encounters speak of a sudden, overwhelming stench, something between rotting meat and damp fur. It comes without warning, hangs in the air like a threat, and disappears just as quickly. The air goes still. The birds fall silent. The forest changes. For decades, indigenous communities in New Mexico have told stories of similar beings, giants in the woods, watchers of the mountains, spirits in the form of men. These aren't always considered physical creatures. Sometimes they're seen as shapeshifters, protectors, omens. In some traditions, speaking about them too openly is considered dangerous. An invitation, a provocation. But of course, modern cryptozoologists have no shortage of secular theories. They'll tell you the half-man is a surviving member of a prehistoric species, something akin to Gigantopithecus, a massive ape that roamed parts of Asia before going extinct. Others think it's a form of undiscovered hominid, one that's managed to remain hidden by avoiding modern human contact and sticking to the deep wilds. A relic of the past, peeking out just enough to make us question what else we've failed to find. Skeptics, naturally, aren't impressed. They blame misidentifications, bears, shadows, hoaxes, mass suggestion. And to be fair, New Mexico's terrain is more known for UFOs and ancient ruins than for forest-dwelling cryptids. It's not exactly Bigfoot Central, but maybe that's what makes the reports here harder to dismiss. Because they shouldn't happen here, and yet they do. The half-man doesn't appear in headlines. He doesn't beg for belief. He's part of a larger pattern, something primal, elusive, and maddeningly unresolved. He shows up just long enough to fracture your understanding of reality, then slips back into the trees like nothing happened. No bones, no nests, just footprints, eyewitness accounts. That sickening feeling that something was watching you, just past the line of trees. What's especially unnerving is the consistency. The height, the gait, the smell, the sense of being watched. These details repeat, again and again, across decades and across geography. From native oral traditions to modern wilderness survival forums, the descriptions overlap in ways that shouldn't be possible unless they're rehearsed. But no one's rehearsing. One park ranger, under anonymity, once said, "There's places I just don't go alone anymore. Not because I saw anything, but because of what I felt. like something didn't want me there. And maybe that's the most important part of the half-man mystery. Not what he is, but what he does to people. He reintroduces uncertainty. He reminds you that the woods are not yours, that there are still places where your flashlight, your map, your logic, they don't apply. There's a kind of humility in that, or maybe terror, depends on who you ask. But the half-man isn't the only legend in New Mexico tied to a face no one can agree on, a body that may or may not be buried, and a death that somehow refuses to stay dead. Because if you head east into the dusty towns where outlaw history bleeds into folklore, you'll find another mystery one involving a boy named Billy, a gun, a grave, and a question no one has ever truly answered. Did Billy the Kid really die that night in Fort Sumner? Or did he ride off into myth, smiling the whole way? Billy the Kid, quality of death. Fort Sumner, New Mexico. The 14th of July, 1881. A shadow moves in the dim light of Pete Maxwell's adobe home. Outside, cicadas hum their night music. Inside, a sheriff named Pat Garrett waits in silence, pistol drawn, breath shallow. A man steps into the room. There's a sharp exchange, maybe words, maybe recognition. A shot is fired. Just one. The man drops, dead. The sheriff leans over, lantern in hand. They say that was the night Billy the Kid died. Except, like all good legends in New Mexico, that's just the part everyone agrees probably happened. Who Billy the Kid actually was depends on who's telling the story. To some, he was William H. Bonney, born Henry McCarty, a drifting orphan who became a gunfighter and folk hero. To others, he was a cold-blooded outlaw with a growing kill count and a talent for escape. Either way, by the time he was allegedly shot by Garrett, he was already a myth in the making. Young, charismatic, reckless, a creature of the Wild West at its most cinematic. And in the chaos of post-war New Mexico, a place caught between lawlessness and statehood, Billy was the perfect canvas for the unfinished story of the American frontier. So when word spread that Pat Garrett had gunned him down in Fort Sumner, the country breathed a kind of theatrical sigh. The kid was dead. The outlaw era had its punctuation mark. The end. Except, maybe not. Because from the very beginning, cracks started forming in the official narrative. Garrett claimed he shot Billy in the dark, identifying him only by voice. No trial, no autopsy. A hasty burial in the local cemetery. No photo of the corpse. Just a sudden, convenient end to one of the most frustrating manhunts of the era. Some found that suspicious. Others found it too neat. Rumors began almost immediately. That Garrett had killed the wrong man. That Billy had been warned and escaped. That the shooting had been staged. And that the kid, always clever, always one step ahead, had vanished into the desert with a new name and a grin. Even those close to Garrett hinted he may have let Billy go. A favor between old friends. In 1948, the story was revived with force. A man in Hico, Texas, named Ollie Brushy Bill Roberts, came forward claiming he was Billy the Kid. At the time, he was in his late 82nd, mostly blind, but determined to prove his identity in order to receive the pardon Billy had supposedly been promised by New Mexico's territorial governor, Lew Wallace. Brushy Bill told his tale. He claimed the whole thing had been a setup, that Garrett killed another man, possibly a hired hand named Billy Barlow, and that the kid had fled west under a new identity, eventually settling in Texas. He provided a detailed timeline, matching scars, insider knowledge, and a photo that some say bears an uncanny resemblance to the young outlaw. The case stirred up a media frenzy. New Mexico's governor refused the pardon. Brushy Bill collapsed and died shortly after, but the mystery lived on. Since then, the debate has bounced back and forth between historians, enthusiasts, and amateur sleuths. Graves have been examined, but DNA tests stalled due to missing remains and unclear chain of custody. The supposed bones of Billy the Kid were washed away in a flood long ago. Brushy Bill's remains are still buried in Texas. Any test now would be part science, part seance. Some believe that Garrett, frustrated by politics, exhausted by the chase, took the path of least resistance. He had a body, he had a name, he wrote a book, he moved on. Others think the story was always bigger than both men, that Billy had to die that night so the narrative could end neatly, like a fable. Because the truth is messy. Truth doesn't sell dime novels. But legends need closure. And yet, the kid still rides. He shows up in small-town diners and forgotten police reports. Faces that look just like him appear in old tintypes that surface every decade or so, sparking fresh debates and forensic reconstructions. Entire documentaries are built on whispers and blurry photographs. Why does it matter so much? Because Billy the Kid represents the last gasp of a world that never quite made sense. The place between law and lawlessness, innocence and infamy. He wasn't good. He wasn't evil. He was complicated. And that's what makes his death so suspicious. Because it's not just that he might have escaped, it's that he deserved to in some strange moral calculus only the Old West understands. We want Billy to have outsmarted the ending. To have laughed one last time before vanishing into history's blind spot. Not because we idolize outlaws, but because we're uncomfortable with neat endings. Especially in New Mexico, where endings rarely behave. And if Billy's death was a question mark, what does that say about the others like him? The ones who disappeared without a grave, without a photo, without even a name left behind. Like the priest who left one day and never returned. Because some disappearances don't begin with a shootout or a chase. They begin with silence, a knock at the door, and then nothing. Father Reynaldo Rivera. On the 7th of August, 1982, the phone rang at the rectory of St. Francis Cathedral in Santa Fe. It was a calm evening, the kind that settles gently on old adobe walls and paints the sidewalks gold with fading sunlight. The call was urgent but polite. A man said he needed a priest. His grandfather was dying at a rest stop just outside of town, near Waldo, a blink-and-you'll-miss-it ghost of a place along Interstate 25. Father Reynaldo Rivera, 57 years old, soft-spoken and well-loved, answered the call. He told the housekeeper he'd be back in a few hours. Then he climbed into his black Ford Limited and drove into the northern New Mexico desert. He never returned. That alone would be enough to earn Father Rivera a place in the archives of unresolved disappearances. But what happened next is where the mystery takes root and refuses to let go. The following day, Rivera's car was found abandoned near the rest stop. No signs of struggle, no signs of life. A few days later, searchers discovered his body approximately 25 miles from where the car had been parked, near a ranch off a rural road. He was fully dressed, lying on his back. His eyeglasses were still in place, a single fatal wound. No signs of robbery, no known motive, and no trace of the man who called. Who would lure a priest out into the desert under the pretense of delivering last rites? Why Rivera? And why so carefully planned? This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. It was precise, chillingly so. And that kind of deliberation leaves a very particular kind of fingerprint, one that never smudges, only hides. Law enforcement launched a full investigation, working with the FBI, combing through church logs, phone records, and tips from the community. They had a few clues. An anonymous caller had also tried to summon another priest, Father Patrick Gerard, just 2 months earlier under nearly identical circumstances. Gerard didn't go. Rivera did. For a brief moment, it seemed like this wasn't just a murder, it was a pattern in the making. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the pattern disappeared again. No one has ever been arrested. No viable suspect has ever been named. One of the more unsettling aspects of the case is how personal it feels. The killer didn't act in haste. He didn't rob or humiliate his victim. He requested a priest, and that's exactly what he got. Some have speculated that the murder may have had ritualistic overtones, perhaps rooted in a personal vendetta or belief system. Others suggest it may have been a thrill kill, carefully staged to confuse investigators and disrupt a community. A few have pointed fingers toward unstable individuals with known grievances against the church. But none of the theories have stuck. Father Rivera was not a controversial figure. He was widely regarded as compassionate, kind, and humble. There were no scandals, no grudges, no shadowy enemies lurking in the background, at least not that anyone has been able to uncover. And maybe that's what makes the whole thing so hard to let go of. This wasn't a man tangled up in something dark. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He simply answered a call for help and walked straight into something that didn't want to be understood. Decades later, the community still remembers. His name is still spoken with reverence, his death with confusion. Some believe the case will never be solved because it was never meant to be. Others think someone, somewhere, is still out there, an old man now, perhaps, who once made a phone call that changed everything. But that call didn't just end one life, it echoed, because not long after, another old legend reemerged in the region, this time tied to a different kind of call, a cipher, to be exact, a clue, maybe, a map, perhaps, a mystery hidden inside another mystery. And the prize? Not justice, not closure. Gold, Beale's treasure. On the surface, the Beale treasure has nothing to do with New Mexico. The story begins in Virginia, sometime in the early 1800s, with a man named Thomas J. Beale, who allegedly discovered a massive cache of gold, silver, and jewels while prospecting in the American West. He wrote 3 coded messages, locked them in an iron box, and entrusted them to an innkeeper with instructions that they not be opened unless he failed to return within 10 years. He never returned. One of the ciphers was eventually solved. It detailed the general contents of the treasure, but the other 2 remained stubbornly uncracked, despite centuries of attempts. The mystery has drawn amateur cryptographers, historians, and conspiracy theorists from all over the world. So, what does any of this have to do with New Mexico? Well, that's the part no one agrees on. Because one persistent theory places the treasure's final resting place not in Virginia, but somewhere in the vast, ungoverned stretches of the New Mexico territory, where Beale and his companions are believed by some to have buried their fortune before disappearing into history. This version of the story suggests that the gold was part of a larger operation, possibly Spanish in origin, or tied to early American expeditions. Beale, according to this theory, was merely a courier or a decoy. And here's where it gets really strange. Some believe the treasure was hidden in the same region as the fabled Victorio Peak hoard, the one Doc Noss claimed to find and lose, the one that never seems to give up its secrets. Maps have surfaced over the years. Some of them appear to correlate with landmarks in southern New Mexico, dry riverbeds, ancient rock formations, caves marked with untranslatable symbols. Beale's codes, when read with certain regional cipher keys, are said to point west, not east, not Virginia, but the desert. Of course, like any good treasure legend, the theories are easy to dismiss until you meet someone who truly believes, and New Mexico has no shortage of true believers. People have been hospitalized after collapsing from heat stroke while searching for the treasure in the Organ Mountains. Others have gone missing entirely, chasing what they believe are ciphered directions buried in Civil War-era documents and Spanish land grants. The obsession is strangely specific. Those who dive into the Beale mystery often become consumed by it, not unlike the victims of the Lost Adams diggings. They begin seeing patterns in everything. Mountains become arrows, shadows become maps. Even weather patterns are interpreted as part of some grand, hidden system. There's a name for this phenomenon: apophenia, the human tendency to see meaningful patterns in random data. But in the New Mexican desert, apophenia is a way of life, especially when treasure might be involved. And then there's the question no one really wants to ask. What if the treasure was already found? What if Beale's codes were solved decades ago quietly by someone with the means to retrieve the hoard without drawing attention? Someone who understood that a good mystery is more valuable than the treasure it protects. After all, the Beale ciphers still show up in popular culture, books, television shows, podcasts. The treasure itself may be gone, but the story, that endures. And as long as there's no final answer, people will keep looking, because the real currency of a treasure story isn't gold. It's mystery. And Beale's isn't the only name in New Mexico attached to a disappearance that refuses to settle. In fact, the next one is already on our list. You know her name. And if you've been paying attention, you know this case was so painful, so unresolved, that we've already mentioned it once. But it's time to look again. Because sometimes, the second glance shows you something the first one missed. Antoinette Cayedito's case. Some mysteries circle back on themselves, like a track you thought you'd left behind, only to realize you've been walking in a loop. This is one of those stories. You've heard the name already, Antoinette Cayedito. Her disappearance haunts the case files of New Mexico like a shadow that won't stay put. But her story isn't just worth repeating. It demands it. Because nothing about her vanishing sits right. Not the timeline, not the evidence, not the long gaps of silence that stretch between brief flashes of hope. It's a mystery that echoes louder each time you hear it. Let's go over the facts again, not out of redundancy, but because repetition is sometimes the only way to understand chaos. In 1986, Antoinette was 9 years old, living in Gallup, New Mexico, a city caught between the boundaries of the Navajo Nation and the edge of mainstream America. That intersection matters. Because Gallup is a place of deep culture and deep neglect, a place where voices, especially indigenous ones, don't always make it into the right rooms. Antoinette disappeared from her home sometime in the early hours of the 6th of April. Her mother and siblings were asleep. A knock at the door. A man's voice. One of the sisters, still a child herself, later said Antoinette got up to answer it. And then, nothing. No break-in, no screaming, no signs of a struggle. Just absence. So complete, it feels staged. She wasn't a troubled kid. She wasn't running away. She was grounded, loved, and yet, the response to her disappearance was slow, confused, because she was Native. Because the case didn't come with a media-ready narrative. Because the system, even when it wants to care, isn't built to care equally. The phone call a year later, the one where a girl whispered her name before a man interrupted, has already been discussed. But let's sit with it a moment longer. Think about what that moment represents. A child possibly calling from captivity. Not screaming, not panicking, just stating her name, as if hoping that alone would be enough, and then cut off. There's a terrible kind of arithmetic in that moment. How far could she have gotten? Where was the phone? How close was help, really? We'll never know. The call couldn't be traced, and like everything else in this story, the details don't lead to closure. They just point toward more silence. Theories have evolved over the years. Some believe Antoinette was taken by someone she knew, someone who waited until the right moment. Others suggest a connection to the broader issue of missing Indigenous women and girls, a crisis that spans not just the Southwest, but the entire continent. And then there's the photo never verified of a girl resembling Antoinette, standing next to a child, believed to be Michael Henley, whose case would be later resolved. It's been dismissed by some, clung to by others, but the resemblance still raises the hairs on the back of your neck. What continues to haunt about this case is how close the answers always seem just out of reach, like you're looking at them through fogged glass. You know something is there, you just can't touch it. That's why her case gets 2 listings, because once is not enough, because some stories refuse to stay quiet, because repeating her name is the only way to keep her from disappearing completely. Antoinette Cayedito. Say it again. And again. And while her case sits like a splinter in the state's conscience, others have slipped even further into obscurity. Missing names with missing context. Stories so underreported they might as well be whispered by the wind. Like the next name on the list, A young man whose disappearance comes with few details but just enough to raise the same kind of chill. Jonathan Francia. There are mysteries that make headlines, burn hot in the national spotlight, and then fade. And then there are the ones that never caught the light to begin with. The cases buried beneath layers of public indifference and procedural forgetfulness. Jonathan Francia's story lives in that shadowed archive, quiet, cold, and largely undocumented. Here's what we know. He went missing in New Mexico. The exact year is disputed. Some records say early 2002, others cite the late 1992. The circumstances? Sparse. No dramatic final sighting, no chilling last phone call, no shaky surveillance footage. Just a name, an age, and a hole where a person should be. He was young, possibly in his 20s, local, no known criminal history, no reason to vanish, no one who expected him to. Sometimes it's the lack of detail that makes a mystery truly haunting. Jonathan Francia isn't just missing from his life, he's missing from the narrative. Try to look him up, and you'll find forum posts with more questions than facts. The occasional archived news clipping. A few angry comments from people who say they knew him, frustrated that no one ever seemed to care enough to ask the right questions. It's hard not to feel that frustration yourself. How does someone disappear without leaving enough breadcrumbs to form a theory? One possibility. The records exist, but aren't public. Maybe the family asked for privacy. Maybe the details were sealed by law enforcement. Or maybe, as is often the case in underfunded jurisdictions, the file was simply lost, physically misplaced in some forgotten drawer, or digitally erased by an outdated system. There are also whispers nothing verifiable about ties to a possible car accident, a report of an abandoned vehicle somewhere off a county road, rumors of foul play. But these are fragments, and they don't hold up under scrutiny, like trying to build a house out of fog. And so, Jonathan Francia becomes a ghost of a ghost, a name with no story, a person rendered invisible not just by disappearance, but by omission. Which brings us to the uncomfortable truth. Some people vanish, and the world barely flinches, especially in places like rural New Mexico, where resources are thin and assumptions are quick. If you're young, male, and brown, your case may not even get a press release. You might not make the evening news, you might not make any news. But you were still here. And maybe that's the most haunting part of Jonathan's mystery. Not just that he vanished, but that his absence never made a sound. No echo, no outrage, just silence. And if his story feels incomplete, that's because at Island, intentionally or not, it's been left that way. The list moves on, the cases continue. And the next one? Another young name, another story swallowed by the land. Different direction, same mystery. How does someone vanish in a place with nowhere to hide? Caitlin Ann Kenny. There's something uniquely eerie about the Colorado-New Mexico border. It's a stretch of land where mountain shadows reach across jurisdictions, and the search and rescue lines drawn on maps don't always line up with the terrain. It's also where Caitlin Ann Kenny disappeared in January 2013, vanishing into a wilderness that, to this day, hasn't given back a single answer. Caitlin was 23, adventurous, spiritual, a musician, a writer, the kind of person described by friends as having a wild heart and a quiet strength. She had been staying near the Green Mountain area on the Colorado side of the border, participating in a wintertime spiritual retreat, an informal, small group, wilderness immersion that emphasized isolation, meditation, and time off-grid. No cell phones, no contact. Just snow, firewood, and the kind of silence that either heals you or swallows you whole. It was during this retreat, somewhere along the rim of the San Juan Mountains, that Caitlin vanished. One morning, she simply wasn't there. At first, it didn't seem like a panic situation. The people on the retreat assumed she had taken a walk or gone into the woods for reflection. She was experienced in nature. She knew the risks. She wasn't reckless. But as the hours passed, worry crept in, then cold, then reality. Search efforts were launched immediately. Authorities from both Colorado and New Mexico were notified, and helicopters scanned the area, despite the brutal winter conditions. But they found nothing. No tracks, no clothing, no signs of struggle, no trace at all. Her last known location was near the Hermosa Creek Wilderness area, a heavily forested region filled with winding trails, hidden ravines, and sharp elevation changes. Searchers said it was like looking for a needle in a stack of pine trees, complicated by freezing temperatures and fresh snowfall that could have erased any trail within hours. But even given the conditions, the complete lack of evidence didn't sit right. People don't just disappear without a trace, not entirely. And yet, that's exactly what happened. Compounding the mystery is the context. Caitlin wasn't a casual hiker who wandered off. She was intentional, grounded, and deeply connected to the land. Friends and family were adamant she wouldn't just vanish without trying to get back, or at least leaving some indication of where she'd gone. As with many cases like this, theories abound. Some believe she succumbed to the elements, hypothermia, or an accidental fall into one of the deep crevices hidden beneath the snowpack. Others have proposed more human explanations: an accident, a misstep, or even an encounter with someone outside the group that went unreported. But then there are the stranger angles, the ones whispered about in online forums and mentioned briefly in investigative reports before being dropped entirely. The San Juan Mountains are full of deep caves, many undocumented. Locals talk of strange sounds at night, lights moving across the ridgelines, things that don't match weather patterns or aircraft. And while nothing concrete ties any of that to Caitlin's case, it's hard not to wonder how a person could disappear so thoroughly in a region already known for disappearing things. Her case remains open, but inactive. There's been no evidence, no recovery, no meaningful update since the initial search was called off. What remains is a story with no middle and no end. Just a beginning and silence. That kind of mystery doesn't fade. It festers. The questions don't diminish with time, they multiply. And unfortunately, Caitlin wasn't the last. Because a year after her disappearance, another young woman went missing under similarly strange circumstances. Another name. Another unsolved riddle written into the desert's dust. Caitlin Arquette. Albuquerque, New Mexico. Summer of 1989. The air is heavy. The kind of thick that seems to cling to streetlights and hang over intersections like a warning. And in this wait of July, 8-year-old Caitlin Arquette drove her turquoise Ford Tempo into a nightmare that would, over the decades, twist into one of the state's most frustratingly unresolved mysteries. Caitlin had just left her friend's house around 10:45 p.m. She was on her way home, a familiar route, safe, suburban. She had spoken to her mom on the phone earlier. Nothing seemed wrong. No signs of panic. No reason to worry. Until there was. Shortly after 11 p.m., her car was found crashed into a utility pole near the intersection of Lomas and Arno. She had been shot in the head, twice. There were no signs of robbery, no obvious motive. She died the next day in the hospital. This wasn't a missing persons case. It was a murder. But what makes it belong in a list of mysteries is what didn't happen after that night. There was no arrest, no strong suspect, and worst of all, no coherent theory that could explain why a well-liked, middle-class teenager with no known enemies would be targeted in such a calculated way. Her mother, Lois Duncan, was more than just a grieving parent. She was a best-selling author famous for suspense novels like I Know What You Did Last Summer. But Caitlin's death changed everything. Duncan poured herself into the case, using every resource she had to push investigators, hire private detectives, and chase down every lead herself when the system didn't seem to be doing enough. What she uncovered turned the story from tragedy into conspiracy. Before her death, Caitlin had been dating a man with alleged connections to Vietnamese gangs in the area, gangs rumored to be involved in insurance fraud and criminal activity tied to stolen vehicles and fake accidents. Duncan believed her daughter had discovered something, and that the shooting was a silencing. She also believed the police were not interested in going where the evidence pointed. Over time, witnesses came forward. Several claimed Caitlin had been followed that night by more than one vehicle. Others suggested she had told friends she feared for her safety in the days leading up to her death. A few leads pointed to connections with organized crime, but the case never moved forward in any meaningful way. In 1992, the Albuquerque Police Department publicly stated that it no longer believed the shooting was random, but that's where the certainty stopped. The physical evidence was weak. The crime scene had been handled with questionable care, and the story, as Duncan kept digging, became a labyrinth of contradictions. Tips were lost. Promising leads ignored. Files misplaced. The kind of mess that can only be explained by either staggering incompetence or something darker. To this day, the case remains open. Caitlin Arquette's murder is technically unsolved. Her mother spent the rest of her life seeking justice until her own death in 2016, having never seen a resolution. And maybe there won't be one. Maybe that intersection in Albuquerque will remain a question mark, a place where motive evaporated, where truth got buried under paperwork and time. Or maybe, like so many stories on this list, it was never meant to be solved. Maybe the point isn't what happened that night, but what didn't. Because the next name on our list carries the same echo. A young woman, full of life, gone in an instant. Another case left adrift in a sea of unasked questions and vanished answers. Katie Sepich. The story of Katie Sepich begins like 1,000 others' college life. A party, a walk home under the stars. It was the end of summer in Las Cruces, New Mexico, in 2003. The kind of desert night where everything feels a little softer, a little quieter. Katie, 22 years old, was a graduate student at New Mexico State University. Known for her intelligence, kindness, and charisma, she was well-liked and deeply loved. The type of person whose absence leaves a visible outline in a room. On the night of the 30th of August, Katie had attended a gathering with friends, a night of harmless fun and music. Around 3 a.m., she reportedly left to walk home. She never arrived. The next day, her body was discovered in an empty lot near the university, a brutal end to a young life filled with promise. And while the details of her death are documented, well publicized, and unlike so many others on this list, eventually solved, the mystery here lies not just in the act itself, but in what followed. The years-long delay in identifying her killer, and the moral questions that arose in the aftermath. Katie's case sat in limbo for years. Evidence was collected. DNA was secured. But there was no match in any database. No suspect. No confession. Just a quiet, painful silence that stretched across months, then years. Her parents, Dave and Jayanne Sepich, turned their grief into advocacy. They didn't just want justice for their daughter, they wanted systemic change. They began lobbying for mandatory DNA collection upon felony arrest, not just after conviction. The logic was simple. If Katie's killer had been arrested for any crime, even unrelated, and his DNA entered into a system, it could have cracked the case. But at the time, the rules didn't allow it. It wasn't until 3 years later that a DNA match finally identified Gabriel Avila, who had been arrested for unrelated domestic violence charges. When his DNA was processed, it matched the profile from the Sepich case almost immediately. Just like that, the mystery, at least the legal part, was over. But the deeper questions remained. Why did it take so long? How many other cases were sitting idle, answers waiting in a database that wasn't allowed to connect the dots? The Sepich family turned their daughter's legacy into a national campaign. Katie's Law, as it came to be known, was eventually passed in New Mexico and influenced federal legislation. It allowed for the collection of DNA from individuals arrested for certain felonies, aiming to prevent the kind of delay that plagued Katie's case. But even this solved mystery leaves a sour taste. Because the truth is, it didn't have to happen that way. The clues were there. The technology existed. The system failed, not in the way that makes headlines, but in the quiet, bureaucratic way that most failures do. And for every case like Katie's where justice finally, belatedly arrives, there are dozens more that never get the luxury of a name, a law, or a resolution. So why include Katie Sepich in a list of unexplained mysteries? Because her story is a reminder that some mysteries don't lie in the unknown. They lie in the known things we refuse to act on, the files we don't open, the data we don't connect, the policies we delay for comfort, or politics, or pride, and because the system that failed her is still failing others. Like the case that follows where, instead of justice delayed, we got justice denied again. Where the story didn't just stop, it duplicated itself. A mystery so unresolved it showed up twice on the list. Not by accident, but because sometimes a single unsolved crime ripples through a place so deeply it demands to be repeated. Las Cruces Bowling Alley Massacre. By now, you already know the basic facts. The 10th of February, 1990, Las Cruces, New Mexico. 2 armed men entered the Las Cruces Bowl early that morning, shortly before opening. They forced employees and children into the office, demanded money from the safe, and then without any clear reason, opened fire on all 7 people present. They left 5 dead. 2 survivors lived to tell the tale. No arrests were made, no suspects identified, no leads that stuck. That alone earns the case a place in the darkest corners of New Mexico's history. But the reason this mystery earns a second appearance on this list, the only case here repeated, is because of how aggressively unresolved it remains. It's a portrait not just of a crime, but of the absence that follows a crime, the kind of silence that feels intentional, weaponized. Why was there no motive, no real evidence? Why did the perpetrators leave witnesses alive if they wanted to silence everyone? Why commit such a brutal act in broad daylight and then disappear without a trace? There's a theory that still circulates, even now, in law enforcement and local circles alike, that this wasn't just a robbery gone wrong, that it was never about the money. The killers left behind $4,000 in the safe, untouched. They didn't wear masks. They weren't in a rush. That's not how simple criminals behave. That's how people behave when the crime is a message. But a message to who? Some think it was an inside job, masked as a random act. Others believe it was connected to drugs, gangs, or a targeted intimidation campaign. But those theories are just educated guesses propped up by the lack of hard evidence. What really haunts is how quiet it all became. The surviving victims gave descriptions. A massive manhunt was launched. Leads were followed. Sketches were released. Then, everything stopped. The case was never officially closed, but it slid into that bureaucratic purgatory reserved for crimes that no one knows how to solve without blowing open something bigger. And maybe that's what happened. Maybe someone knew who did it. Maybe they still do. But the risk of digging deeper outweighed the need for answers. That's the real terror behind the Las Cruces Bowling Alley Massacre, not just that it happened, but that it was allowed to remain unsolved, as if the community had to choose between peace and truth, and peace won. And so it circles back, again and again. Because this wasn't a ghost story. It wasn't a legend passed down. It happened. It was real. The crime scene photos exist. The families are still grieving. And the killers? If they're still alive, they walk free. Unbothered. Untouched. Somewhere out there, in the dry light of New Mexico. So yes, this mystery is here twice. Because once wasn't enough. And next, another place where peace masquerades as quiet. A hotel where the walls whisper, the lights flicker, and the guests don't always check out alone. La Posada Hotel. In the heart of Santa Fe, just a few blocks from the historic plaza where the past clings to every stucco wall and flickering lantern, sits the La Posada Hotel, a luxurious retreat built atop the ruins of a 19th-century mansion. But beneath the polished tiles and romantic charm lies something else, something older, something that breathes through the cracks in the adobe, something that refuses to stay quiet. You check in for the spa, you stay for the architecture, you don't expect the cold spots, or the footsteps, or the woman in black who walks the hallways at night, searching for something no one can give her. Her name, they say, was Julia Staub. The legend begins in 1865, when Abraham Staab, a successful German Jewish merchant, built a lavish brick mansion for his wife Julia and their children. He was a man of stature, wealthy, connected. Julia, by contrast, was quiet, delicate. She rarely left the house. Some say it was illness, others say it was sadness. The couple had several children, but one died young, and Julia was never quite the same afterward. She withdrew from public life, kept to herself, became a ghost of a woman long before she ever died. And then, in 1896, she did die officially of natural causes, but unofficially, whispers began to circulate that Julia had been deeply unhappy, that her soul never left the home, that the walls of the mansion had absorbed her grief, and that now she lived inside them. When the property was converted into a hotel in the 1932nd and later renovated into the luxurious La Posada de Santa Fe Resort and Spa, the activity didn't stop. It ramped up. Guests began reporting strange phenomena, water faucets turning on by themselves, doors locking from the inside, cold spots that couldn't be explained by the building's ventilation. Housekeepers reported seeing a woman in 19th-century clothing appear and vanish within seconds. Children spoke of the sad lady who watched them from the corner of the room. But most of the sightings centered around one particular room, Suite 256, Julia's former bedroom. People who stay in that suite report vivid dreams. Objects move, electronics malfunction. Some guests report a sudden, overwhelming sense of grief, as though someone else's sorrow had entered their chest. More than one has left the room in the middle of the night, unable to explain why. The hotel, to its credit, doesn't shy away from the stories. In fact, they lean into them. Julia is part of the brand now, a spectral mascot for romantic tragedy. They've even had paranormal investigators in to study the room. Most leave with more questions than answers. Some don't stay the full night. Skeptics, of course, have their explanations. Faulty wiring, drafts, sleep paralysis. But even they admit there's something off about La Posada. The kind of off that doesn't come from design flaws. The kind of off that feels like someone watching you from the other side of a mirror. And that's what makes this mystery so persistent. There's no crime scene, no disappearance, no violent history. Just one woman's sadness echoing across a century. Julia never asked to be remembered like this. But now, she's part of the building woven into the rugs, the woodwork, the nightly routines of staff who leave certain doors open, certain windows cracked, just in case. Because even if you don't believe in ghosts, you believe in stories. And the story of Julia Staub, of a woman who was silenced in life and mourns in death, refuses to be quiet. But Julia isn't the only restless spirit in New Mexico's hotels. A few hundred miles north, in a place where outlaws once drank and argued and stared down their final nights, there's another building with a legacy steeped in gunpowder, whiskey, and uninvited guests. Street James Hotel, Cimarron. If La Posada is haunted by sorrow, the Street James Hotel is haunted by something else entirely: violence. Plain and simple. Located in Cimarron, New Mexico, a once lawless outpost on the edge of the frontier, the Street James was built in 1872 by Henri Lambert, the personal chef of President Abraham Lincoln. You'd think a man who served at the White House would retire into quiet comfort. Instead, he opened a saloon in one of the most dangerous towns in the American West. The hotel quickly became a hotspot for legends. Jesse James, Buffalo Bill, Cody, Wyatt Earp, and Doc Holliday all allegedly passed through its doors. But so did countless outlaws, drifters, gamblers, and gunmen whose names are long forgotten. The Street James was more than a hotel. It was a battleground. It's said that 26 men died within its walls, and several bullet holes still remain in the ceiling of the dining room as proof. The building's violent past didn't die with the century. Today, the Street James operates as a functioning hotel and as one of the most famously haunted locations in the state. Guests and staff regularly report paranormal activity, particularly in rooms 17 and 18. Room 1-8, known as the Thomas James Wright Room, is so active it's often not rented out at all. Legend has it that Wright, a man who won the hotel in a poker game, was shot in the back before he could take ownership. He died in the room and apparently never left. People who have stayed there, or tried to, speak of voices in the hallway when no one's around, lights flickering violently, shadows moving against the grain of light. In room 1-8, guests have reported being pushed, touched, or awakened by whispers. Some have seen full apparitions, men in dusty 19th century garb, staring at them silently, then vanishing. The hotel embraces its haunted reputation. It hosts ghost tours, themed events, and even has a logbook for guests to record their paranormal experiences. It's part spectacle, part warning. Because even the staff, those who have worked there for years, speak of the feeling that creeps up at night, the sense that you're being watched by something that doesn't want you there. But what's striking isn't just the sightings, it's the pattern. The Street James doesn't just house one ghost, it houses many, too many. And most aren't mournful spirits like Julia Staub. They're angry, resentful, restless. The air in the hotel isn't heavy with sadness, it's electric with tension, like something's always about to happen, again. Some say the hotel is cursed. Others think it's simply saturated in unresolved energy, decades of violence layered over itself like sediment. And maybe that's what a haunting really is. Not spirits, but history refusing to stay buried. So when you check into the Street James, you're not just sleeping in a hotel, you're stepping into a battlefield. A place where the walls have heard things they weren't meant to, and where silence is never just silence. And if you think ghosts only haunt buildings, well, the next name on the list is a haunting all its own. A mystery so strange, even the name sounds like something pulled from the pages of a dark fable. His name was Strider Styrfire, and no one seems to know who or what he really was. Strider Styrfire. Sometimes, a mystery begins with a name that doesn't sound real. Strider Styrfire isn't just difficult to pronounce. It feels like it was stitched together from fantasy novels and late-night fever dreams. It's the kind of name that appears once in a local police blotter or an internet forum and then echoes endlessly through speculation. Except in this case, the name was attached to something real. Or at least, something that happened. And what happened is hard to say exactly. Strider Styrfire appeared in public records only briefly, in connection with an incident in New Mexico that still has no official explanation. What little exists is fragmented police notes, a few grainy online posts, secondhand testimonies, and one incomplete report allegedly filed by state authorities. What ties them together is a sense of confusion. Not horror, not violence, just confusion so deep and so fundamental that no one can agree on what the event even was. The earliest mention of Strider Styrfire appears in a New Mexico Emergency Services dispatch log from the late 1992. The record references a disturbance in a remote area between Datil and Pie Town, a stretch of high desert and pine forest that already feels like the end of the world. A man had reportedly flagged down a motorist, barefoot and disoriented, speaking in what one witness described as old-timey English with Scandinavian inflections. He claimed to be looking for someone named the Gatekeeper. He said he had come through a rift and that he had to warn the vessel. The motorist thought he was mentally ill and called for help. When officers arrived, they reportedly found the man calm, polite, and articulate just deeply, inexplicably, it's wrong. No ID, no fingerprints on file, no social security number. He gave his name as Strider Steyerfire. That was all. He was taken into protective custody, but no charges were filed. According to sparse internal notes, he was kept overnight in a holding cell and transferred for psychological evaluation. But that's where the trail ends. The official paper trail cuts off after 48 hours. Some say he was transferred to a facility. Others say he simply vanished. No one knows who signed the release form. His fingerprints reportedly collected were never matched to any database. And then, nothing. No relatives ever came forward. No missing persons report matched his description. And the name Strider Steyerfire has never been linked to any birth record, immigration document, or online presence. It's as if he stepped into New Mexico from nowhere and left in the same direction. Naturally, the theories came flooding in. Some believe he was an amnesiac, possibly using a pseudonym inspired by fantasy books or role-playing games. Others believe it was a psyop, a planted story meant to draw attention away from something else in the region. A few theorists go even further, suggesting that Strider Steyerfire wasn't a person at all, but a symbol, or even a code name, tied to an underground network of people monitoring geomagnetic anomalies in the Southwest. And then there are those who take him at his word. They think he came from somewhere else, another time, another dimension, another reality bleeding into our own through one of the strange thin spots in New Mexico's wilderness. It sounds like science fiction until you read the unconfirmed reports of strange lights in the sky that same week, just west of Pie Town. Until you learn that the town's few hundred residents have long told stories of ghostly travelers and the thin place out in the trees. No one has seen Strider Steyerfire since, or maybe they have and didn't know it. What remains is a hole in the narrative, a name that feels like a placeholder, a man who may have been a warning, or a glitch, or a myth that forgot it wasn't supposed to show up in real life. But not every unexplained case has a name, much less one as bizarre as that. Some disappear before anyone even knows they're gone. Some leave behind a photograph, a trace, a shoe in the dirt. And the next name on the list is one that once had a nation's attention, if only for a moment, before becoming yet another whisper in New Mexico's unsolved catalog of missing. Michael Henley. In April of 1988, Michael Henley Jr., a 9-year-old boy from Albuquerque, went on a family camping trip in the Zuni Mountains of western New Mexico. It was supposed to be a weekend of fresh air, pine needles, and campfires. But somewhere between the flicker of morning sunlight and the scramble of tents and gear, Michael disappeared. One moment he was there playing, wandering just a few yards from his family. The next, he was gone. The terrain was rough, but not impassable, forested, but not endless. The search began immediately. Helicopters, dogs, volunteers, rangers. For weeks, the family and the local authorities combed the area. Every trail, every dry creek, every rock formation. They found nothing. No signs of struggle, no footprints beyond a certain point. No clothing, no answers. Then, months later, the mystery deepened. A photograph surfaced in Port St. Joe, Florida, more than 1,000 miles from the Zuni Mountains. It was a Polaroid, found in a parking lot by a woman who claimed it had been dropped by someone in a van. The image showed 2 children, a boy and a girl, bound and gagged, sitting on what looked like a mattress in the back of a van. The boy, many believed, resembled Michael Henley. The girl was thought by some to be Tara Calico, another New Mexico teen who had vanished just months later. The photo became national news. FBI involvement followed. Parents identified the children with varying degrees of confidence. But like so many tantalizing leads, it didn't lead anywhere definitive. The identities in the photo were never conclusively confirmed. The girl was never found. The boy? Well, Michael's case took a darker turn. In 1990, 2 years after his disappearance, Michael's remains were discovered in the very mountains where he had gone missing, not far from the original campsite. No signs of violence. No sign of the boy in the Polaroid. Just bones, and a story that now seemed impossible. How could a child's body go unnoticed for 2 years in an area that had been thoroughly searched? Had the remains been moved? Were they simply missed in the initial search? Or was the Polaroid never Michael to begin with, just a tragic coincidence made worse by desperate hope? To this day, that question has never been fully answered. Some still believe Michael was kidnapped and later returned, or that he died trying to escape. Others believe he succumbed to the elements early on, and the rest is just noise and projection. The search for closure, after all, is a messy business. Sometimes it creates answers where there are none, but the discomfort of his story lies in its contradictions, the timing, the photo, the fact that 2 of New Mexico's most notorious child disappearances happened so close together in both time and space and may have been unrelated, or not. Michael Henley's case is technically solved. His remains were found. Cause of death, undetermined. But there's no peace in that. Because solving a case isn't the same as understanding it. And in the next one, we don't even get that much. Just another name, another child gone, and another hole in the world. Dale Hyde. If you search for Dale Hyde in mainstream databases, you won't find much. No national headlines, no multi-part investigative podcasts, no candlelight vigils aired on the evening news. What you will find if you're persistent and know where to look is a handful of scattered references to a man who vanished from New Mexico with so little fanfare. It's as if he was never supposed to be noticed in the first place. That's what makes Dale Hyde's story so disturbing. According to the sparse information that survives, Dale Hyde was last seen in the late 1982nd, possibly early 1992nd, somewhere near the Gila National Forest. The details are foggy. Some reports suggest he was an experienced outdoorsman. Others claim he was living off the grid, voluntarily removed from society. There are even unconfirmed whispers that he was a survivalist, testing the limits of isolation in one of the most rugged regions of New Mexico. What's known is that Dale was reported missing only after someone, a friend, a relative, maybe just a neighbor, noticed he hadn't been seen for a while. The time frame of his disappearance is murky. By the time authorities began to investigate, there was no trail to follow. His camp, if he had one, was never found. No vehicle, no ID, no bank transactions, no cell phone to ping. It was as if he stepped into the wilderness and was absorbed by it. The lack of documentation only fuels the mystery. Some amateur sleuths believe Dale Hyde was using an alias, hiding from something, possibly the law, possibly his past. Others think he may have uncovered something he wasn't supposed to see while wandering the backcountry. A clandestine operation, a hidden site, maybe even one of those rumored underground military installations whispered about in conspiracy circles. But there's another, more unsettling possibility that Dale Hyde was simply a man who fell through the cracks. That he disappeared, not because of something spectacular or sinister, but because disappearing is easier than we like to admit. Especially in New Mexico, where wide open spaces, minimal oversight, and jurisdictional gray zones create the perfect environment for people to quietly vanish without a ripple. And still, there are stories. One local hiker claimed to find what looked like a crude shelter deep in the forest, made of tarps, fallen logs, and camouflaged netting. Inside were weathered books, an old camp stove, and scraps of paper with unintelligible notes scrawled in black ink. No name was attached, no official link to Hyde. But the timing and location lined up eerily well. Another rumor points to a weathered journal, supposedly discovered by a park ranger in a now-sealed evidence box. The entries were dated inconsistently, the handwriting shifting in clarity and coherence, ending abruptly with a single line. They come at night now. It could be fiction. It could be internet-fueled embellishment. but it fits the Dale Hyde story too well to dismiss outright. And maybe that's the real heart of this mystery, not just the disappearance of a man, but the absence of his story. A case without a file, a vanishing without a headline. A reminder that some people don't get the benefit of investigation, only the echo of speculation. Whether Dale Hyde died in the wilderness, walked away from his life, or was erased by something more intentional, we'll likely never know. But he's not the only one to disappear into the strange hush of New Mexico's high deserts. Because next on the list is a man whose name suggests something calm, something almost ordinary. But the story of David Stone is anything but David Stone. It starts like a joke. A Wall Street banker walks into the desert. But this isn't a punchline. It's one of the most unsettling disappearances New Mexico has ever known, largely because of how deliberately strange it became. David Stone was 29 years old, a successful stockbroker from El Paso, Texas. By all accounts, he was sharp, driven, and intensely philosophical. He had also, according to friends and coworkers, become increasingly obsessed with numerology and New Age belief systems in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. He spoke of needing clarity, of seeking deeper truths, of breaking through something no one else could see. On Halloween Day in 1988, David Stone drove into the desert near Lordsburg, New Mexico. He parked his black Toyota Camry at a remote pullout off Highway 80 and began walking. No one knows exactly when or why. What's known is that he left behind no note, no itinerary, and no clear reason for his journey, only cryptic fragments and a trail that might have been designed not to be followed. His car was discovered a few days later. Inside, investigators found a few personal belongings and something else, a copy of the Book of Numbers, not the biblical one, but a guide to numerology. In the margins were notes, equations, patterns, ideas about destiny, cycles, and cosmic maps. As searchers combed the arid hills and rocky slopes near Granite Gap, they began to find more clues, though clues might be too generous a word. They found a stone circle, a pyramid made of twigs and small rocks, footprints leading nowhere, scribbles in the sand. All of it felt staged, intentional, but with no clear message. And then came the most chilling detail. Carved into the sand near one of the makeshift altars was the word "gone." It took 5 years before David's remains were found by hikers several miles from where he had parked his car. The desert had claimed him. Official cause of death? Exposure. But everything else was unanswered. Why the walk? Why the cryptic symbols? Was it a vision quest gone wrong? A psychotic break? A spiritual experiment with no safety net? Some believe David was following a numerological path, guided by dates, lunar cycles, and mathematical codes he believed were leading him to some kind of revelation. Others argue he had a mental health crisis, one that manifested through the language of mysticism and self-erasure. But there's also a darker theory, that David wasn't alone out there, that he met someone or something who exploited his beliefs and drew him deeper into the desert. That the clues left behind weren't breadcrumbs, but warnings. That the word "gone" wasn't a statement of absence, but of intention. What complicates the case is how calm David reportedly was in the days before. Not manic, not erratic, focused, serene, as if he knew something no one else did. And maybe he did. Maybe David Stone was chasing something real, or at least real to him. A pattern, a cipher, a hidden system buried in the sands of New Mexico. But if he found it, he took it with him. And now all that remains is a skeleton in the desert, a trail of broken symbols, and a question mark that refuses to fade. Next comes a mystery even more obscure, a case so lightly touched by public attention that it almost feels invented. Except it isn't, because Elf may not be just a name, it might be a code, or a warning, or something far stranger. L.F. Some mysteries leave behind bones, others only initials. This one offers 3. Elf. No full name, no confirmed identity, no birth certificate or obituary. Just 3 capital letters that appear in the footnotes of New Mexico's deep archives of the unexplained, like a whisper coded in military shorthand. The first time Elf shows up in public records is somewhere in the early 2002, linked to an anonymous file held allegedly by a fringe network of amateur radio enthusiasts, cryptographers, and ex-military contractors who claim to monitor low-frequency signal activity in the Four Corners region. That part is already bizarre. But what makes it eerie is what the signals were supposedly connected to. Extremely low-frequency transmissions, hence the acronym ELF, and the person who supposedly tracked them to a location deep in northern New Mexico, not far from the border of the Carson National Forest. The individual referred to only as ELF in declassified forums claimed to have triangulated a pattern of signals that pulsed at 76 Hz, matching frequencies known to affect the human nervous system. According to their logs, the signals spiked at irregular intervals, always at night, always centered on a grid square containing little more than rocks, sagebrush, and an abandoned concrete structure rumored to have been part of a Cold War-era radar facility. This is where the details get thin and the conspiracy takes over. Elf, who may have been a woman, based on some surviving chat logs, allegedly went to the site in 2004, alone, to investigate. She posted sporadic updates to a secure forum, described seeing strange lights, feeling disoriented, hearing hum-like oscillations she claimed were coming from inside her own head. Then, the update stopped. A week later, another forum user screen named Binary Echo claimed to have found her van abandoned near a dirt road leading into the brush. Inside were notebooks, antenna schematics, and a hand-drawn map with one word scrawled across the center: tuned. There was no official investigation, no missing persons report, not under that name anyway. And without a real name, there could be no formal search, just theories. Some believed Elf was attempting to uncover remnants of Project Sanguine or other Cold War communication experiments involving Elf transmissions. Others speculated that the signals were not man-made at all, but geological or extraterrestrial. There are even claims that the transmissions mirrored brainwave activity recorded during altered states of consciousness, the kind you find in deep meditation or near-death experiences. But here's the real kicker. The signal Elf documented? It still shows up. To this day, hobbyists in the region pick up unexplained pulses in the 76 Hz range. No clear source, no government agency takes responsibility, no towers, no satellites. Just an invisible rhythm beating through the northern New Mexico ground like a buried drum. And every time it spikes, someone inevitably asks the same question: where did Elf go? Was she a code name? A ghost story created by conspiracy forums to explain electromagnetic noise? Or was she real, a lone explorer who stumbled on something too strange, too big, and simply vanished under its weight? Some believe she found what she was looking for. Others believe she never left that desert. And maybe she didn't, because the next mystery isn't just about someone who went missing. It's about a name, a very real one that sits in police databases, forever unsolved. And this time, the person left behind just enough to be almost found: Ed Barbara. The name, Ed Barbara, doesn't carry the weight of urban legend. You won't find his face on t-shirts, no yearly memorial events, no cult documentaries, and yet, his case has managed to endure in the shadows of New Mexico's cold files for years, largely because of one thing: he shouldn't have been able to disappear. Ed Barbara was, by all accounts, a steady guy. Middle-aged, lived in northern New Mexico, had a modest job, a modest house, and a reputation for being decent, though intensely private. Not the kind of person who makes waves, and certainly not the kind to end up on a mystery list. Until he vanished. The details are minimal, eerily so. In 1999, Barbara's car was found pulled off a scenic overlook near Abiquiu, parked neatly, locked. Inside were a few personal items: a backpack, a half-finished crossword puzzle, and a disposable camera with several undeveloped photos. He had told no one where he was going, left no note, didn't pack for a trip, just left. The photos, when developed, revealed nothing extraordinary. Shots of red rock formations, a few blurry close-ups of plant life. One photo, a shot of the road behind his parked car, showed something odd: a dust cloud in the distance. Some said it looked like another car. Others said it looked like nothing. The area was searched. No signs of a struggle. No footprints leading away. No signs he had gone over the cliff. Cadaver dogs picked up nothing. A helicopter scan yielded no clues. For weeks, the local sheriff's office held on to the hope that Barbara would turn up somewhere, maybe in Taos, maybe across the border in Colorado. But he never did. Then came the calls. In the months after his disappearance, Ed's landline answering machine kept plugged in at the request of family received several voicemails. Each was static-heavy, almost inaudible. But on the third message, a voice barely discernible can be heard saying, "I'm okay, don't follow." The call was traced to a payphone in Española. The surveillance footage had already been wiped. There was no proof it was him. To this day, the prevailing theories are a frustrating mix of the mundane and the bizarre. Some believe Ed Barbara staged his disappearance and started over under a new identity. That the camera, the cryptic voicemail, even the dust cloud, were all pieces of a carefully orchestrated exit. Others are convinced something darker happened, that Ed witnessed something, got too close to someone, or ran afoul of something he didn't understand. Theories range from cartel involvement to government surveillance to more esoteric explanations involving the so-called veil between physical and spiritual worlds, long rumored to be thin in the high mesas of New Mexico. What keeps Ed's story alive isn't just the disappearance, it's the contradiction. People don't vanish quietly in the age of databases and paper trails, but Ed did. He was the kind of person the world usually keeps track of: bank accounts, phone records, taxes, and then suddenly, nothing. Like someone flipped a switch. And so, his name lingers. Not infamous, not even particularly well known, just unsolved. And if his story feels like a slow fade into silence, the next one is even fainter. Because what happens when a person disappears and there's no story at all? When all we have is a name, and the mystery is that nobody ever really knew them to begin with? That's where we're headed next. And the name Gerard Peters is all we've got. Gerard Peters. By the time most disappearances are reported, the mystery has already begun. A bag left behind, a phone gone dark, a door that didn't lock behind someone who didn't come home. But in the case of Gerard Peters, there was no such moment. No last known sighting. No vehicle found on the side of a highway. No timeline to reconstruct. Gerard Peters simply faded. Not in the poetic sense, in the deeply unsettling, administrative sense. No body, no belongings, no public outcry. Just a name entered into a database, filed under missing, and then never removed. The facts are brutally sparse. He was a young man, possibly in his early 20s, living somewhere in central New Mexico, either Santa Rosa or near the smaller, more rural outskirts of Torrance County. No confirmed birth date has ever been tied to his case. No official missing persons flyer exists that includes a photo of him. What we do know comes from a few scattered mentions in archived law enforcement dispatch records and a defunct page from a regional database that listed him as unaccounted for since early 2002. If you're getting the sense that Gerard Peters wasn't exactly high priority, you're right. That's part of what makes this so uncomfortable. He may have been transient or off the grid. He may have had no fixed address, no formal employer, no immediate family to report him missing. Or perhaps he did have all those things, and they just slipped through the cracks, forgotten, or deliberately ignored. There are rumors, of course there are. Some online forums claim that Gerard was last seen walking out into the Estancia Basin, barefoot, carrying a wooden staff and a notebook. One user who claimed to know him described Gerard as the kind of person who believed in omens, who thought the desert was trying to talk to him. Others say he'd been reading heavily about ley lines and magnetic field disturbances, particularly in the high desert near Manzano Mountain, an area long associated with strange disappearances and unmarked government property. Whether any of that is true doesn't matter as much as the fact that it could be, because in the absence of real data, speculation is the only language left. A few local law enforcement sources anonymous naturally have said that the case file, if it ever existed, was slim, less than a page, a name, an approximate age. Possibly an off-the-record statement from someone who'd seen him last, maybe weeks or even months before the file was opened. Beyond that, nothing. So what happened to Gerard Peters? Did he go off-grid intentionally? A voluntary disappearance into the vast blank spaces of New Mexico's backcountry? Was he a casualty of circumstance, forgotten by a system that never quite noticed him in the first place? Or was he swallowed by something more deliberate? There's a theory among some in the high desert fringe circles that certain regions of New Mexico, particularly the wide open corridors between Roswell, Corona, and Mountainair, are what they call quiet zones. Not in the electromagnetic sense, but in a human sense. Places where people go missing and stay missing, where signals drop, memories fragment, and footprints fail to lead anywhere. And maybe Gerard found one of those places, or maybe he became one. Because when a person leaves behind no story, the only story is us grasping at meaning in the dark. But the list moves forward, and the names get no less mysterious. The next belongs to another face that barely flickers across official records, and yet lingers like a shadow burned into old film. Her name is Lori Smith. And she, too, never came back. Lori Smith. There are names that come with narratives. Lori Smith does not. That, in itself, is part of the mystery. Her disappearance, like that of Gerard Peters, occupies an uncomfortable place in the missing persons lexicon. A record without a record. No photograph, no birth date, no precise location. Just a line in a state-level archival database and the occasional mention in compilations of New Mexico's unsolved cases. All we know is that Lori Smith was reported missing sometime in the early 2000s, possibly from the southern corridor of the state around Silver City, or maybe closer to the Oregon Mountains. The information changes depending on the source, which is another way of saying no one really knows. In one unofficial timeline compiled by a true crime researcher on an internet archive forum, Lori was last seen leaving her apartment in Las Cruces. She told a neighbor she was heading toward the canyon. She never came back. Was it an ordinary walk? A hike? A meeting? The records don't say. That's where the data ends. Everything else is just echo. Some reports mention that Lori had recently lost her job and was struggling with housing. Others suggest she'd been seeking something spiritual, spending time in remote areas known for their energy vortexes and sacred geography. The Oregon Mountains, after all, have long been rumored to be a place of power, of convergence, of vanishing. And then there's the notebook. One local hiker claims to have found it while exploring a remote ridge east of Aguirre Springs in 2003. Water-damaged and barely legible, it allegedly contained stream-of-consciousness entries about the land waking up, about moving between layers, about watchers behind the stone. No direct reference to Lori Smith was inside, but tucked between the pages was a library card bearing her name. The hiker turned it over to authorities. The notebook was never seen again. When asked about it, local police denied any such item was submitted. But the man who found it stands by his account and has, on more than one occasion, spoken publicly about what he saw scribbled on the last page. This place is a mirror. It sees me too. Skeptics have dismissed the entire thing as myth-making. An urban legend stitched from too many episodes of paranormal television and unsourced Reddit posts. But others aren't so sure. Because Lori's story, or what remains of it, mirrors too many others. Too many quiet vanishings in the Southwest. Too many women whose names fall off the radar before anyone starts looking. She may have met with foul play. She may have gotten lost, or left intentionally. But the questions hang there like heat in the canyon air. Why was there no coordinated search? Why did her story never make local news? Why did the only tangible evidence of her even being real disappear into a police locker that, allegedly, doesn't exist? Some think the notebook was a hoax. Others think it was classified. But either way, Lori Smith's story is now something more than a disappearance. It's a haunting. And the last name on this list, Lyle Moody, isn't much different. A man who, like so many before him, seems to have evaporated somewhere between two pieces of desert sky. A story barely told, but impossible to forget. Lyle Moody. Lyle Moody wasn't supposed to be mysterious. By all accounts, he lived a modest life, low profile, routine, the kind of person you'd pass on the street without noticing. But somehow, he ended up as one of the most lingering unknowns in New Mexico's unsolved archive. Not because of what we know about him, but because of what we absolutely, profoundly don't. Lyle's name appears toward the tail end of most lists of New Mexico's unsolved cases, not alphabetically, chronologically. His disappearance is believed to have occurred sometime in the mid-2002, possibly as late as 2009. But that's already up for debate. The date of disappearance varies across sources. Some say it was in June, others place it closer to the fall. Even the year flickers. There's no firm consensus, no obituary, no definitive last seen moment, just fragments. The kind that refuse to piece together. The one commonality is location. Somewhere in or around Carrizozo, a quiet town at the edge of the Tularosa Basin, home to wind-blown highways, cracked pavement, and an ever-present feeling that time is running in reverse. Carrizozo has long been a place people drive through, not to, a place you stop for gas and forget you ever saw. That, it seems, was where Lyle Moody simply disappeared from existence. What we know barely is that Lyle was middle-aged, possibly late 42nd, and worked intermittently as a mechanic or handyman. No confirmed family ties in the area. No social media presence, no bank trail after 2009. He was reportedly renting a small trailer on the outskirts of town. He paid in cash. He kept to himself. That's where the paper trail ends, and where the stories begin. Some residents recall a man matching Lyle's description who frequented a local diner, always ordered coffee, never spoke unless spoken to. Others say he had become increasingly paranoid in his final months, asking strange questions about radio towers, air traffic, and the people in the trucks. Whether this was mental illness, meth-fueled paranoia, or something else entirely depends on who you ask. But the reports are consistent. Lyle believed someone was watching him, and then he was gone. The trailer was left unlocked. Inside were all his belongings, clothes, tools, a few worn paperbacks. His wallet and ID were still there. So were his boots, but not Lyle. Local police filed a missing persons report, but according to one former deputy, it never escalated. There wasn't much to go on, he reportedly said. It was like trying to find a shadow in a thunderstorm. The search was minimal. A few informal sweeps of the area. A flyover. Nothing was found. Except, 3 months later, a hiker claimed to have found an old denim jacket draped across a juniper bush near Valley of Fires, just west of Carrizozo. Inside the pocket was a folded scrap of paper that read, in careful all-caps handwriting, "The horizon has teeth." No other identifying details. No name. No body. No prints. The jacket was never confirmed to belong to Lyle Moody, and no DNA test was conducted, or, if it was, the results were never released publicly. There are theories, of course. The prevailing one, that Lyle simply walked into the desert and never came back. That he was mentally unstable or disillusioned with life and chose the ultimate exit. It's the easiest explanation. The most digestible. But some point to the geography. Carrizozo lies in proximity to some of the Southwest's most infamous dead zones, the White Sands Missile Range, the Trinity Test Site, unmarked military corridors with locked gates and unclear jurisdiction, places where even Google Earth blurs the details. One theory shared mostly on message boards and speculative blogs is that Lyle witnessed something he wasn't supposed to. Maybe a weapons test, maybe a crash, maybe something stranger. Others believe he wasn't from around here at all, not just in the geographical sense, but in the ontological one. That he was part of something larger, maybe even sent to observe something. There's a fringe claim that Lyle Moody's name doesn't appear in any U.S. Census data before the early 2002, that his Social Security record starts abruptly, that he wasn't so much born as inserted. If that sounds like conspiracy theory theater, it probably island. Probably. But then again, the quietest mysteries are often the most corrosive. They don't shout, they whisper. They make you wonder not just what happened, but why you never heard about it. Why didn't Lyle Moody's story make the news? Why was there no media attention? Why does he exist only as a footnote in a handful of databases, most of which don't agree on the details? The uncomfortable truth might be that some people vanish without a narrative, that they become mysteries because they didn't leave behind a scandal or a camera-ready backstory, that their erasure is complete not because of foul play, but because of the world's casual indifference to quiet people in forgotten places. And that's what makes Lyle Moody's case so haunting. It's not dramatic. It's not even particularly cinematic. It just happened. And in a list of 33 unexplained New Mexico mysteries, maybe that's the most unsettling thing of all. Not the aliens, not the disappearances, not the staircases to nowhere or the cryptic symbols carved into sand, but a man no one looked for, who maybe never expected to be found. And so, with that last mystery, we close the loop not with an answer, but with the same silence that started it. Because if New Mexico teaches us anything, it's that mystery isn't a genre. It's a landscape, and it's still growing.